Let me for me. 9 of us had driven out in 2 vehicles on a Friday morning in late October. The plan was simple enough. A week of hiking through the remote trails of eastern Kentucky, deep into the heart of the Cumberland range. No cell service, no ranger stations for miles. Just 8 other people, our gear, and whatever stories the forest wanted to tell us. Charles Powell had organized the trip. He'd hiked these mountains before, or so he claimed. Owen Patterson had confirmed it. 2 reliable guys, we'd all thought. 2 guys who knew what they were doing. Now, 4 days in, I wasn't so sure about anything anymore. The coffee had gone cold in my hands. I hadn't drunk any of it. Around me, the forest was doing something it shouldn't be doing. It was breathing. I know how that sounds. I know what people will say when they read this. But it's the only word for it. The trees weren't just swaying in the wind. They were breathing, contracting and expanding like the ribs of something massive that had decided to lie down around our camp and watch us. "You coming back inside?" Nora's voice cut through the morning. She was standing in the entrance of the large tent, her breath fogging in the cool air. Nora Long, 27 years old. Marketing consultant from Nashville. She'd talked more than anyone else on the first 2 days of the hike. By day 3, she'd stopped talking almost entirely. "In a minute," I told her. She didn't push it. Nobody pushed anything anymore. The trip had started at a trailhead called Devil's Backbone, which should have been our first warning about what a stupid idea this was. Hazel Hughes had made a joke about it on the drive up, the kind of joke people make when they're nervous and trying to cover it with humor. She was a geologist from Ohio, 39 years old, and she'd been the one who suggested the route in the first place. High elevation, isolated, minimal foot traffic. Perfect for a group that wanted to feel like they were the only humans left in the world. The problem was that we weren't the only humans left in the world. We just might have been the only humans left in our corner of it. "Did you hear it last night?" Owen Patterson appeared beside me, somehow without me noticing his approach. That had been happening more and more. The way sound worked in these mountains had changed. Or maybe our hearing had changed. Maybe we were all slowly losing the ability to perceive the world in the normal way. Owen was 28. Ex-military, the kind of guy who carried a knife and could identify plants and knew how to filter water through rocks and cloth. He'd been Charles's friend, the connection that had brought most of the rest of us together. We trusted him because he seemed like someone worth trusting. "Hear what?" I asked, though I knew what he meant. "The calling," he said. "Around 2 in the morning. It sounded like—" "I don't know what it sounded like. Probably an animal," I said, knowing it wasn't. "Animals don't call like that," Owen said. He was looking out at the ridgeline the way I'd been looking at it. His jaw was tight. "Animals don't repeat the sound the way it did. That was someone or something using our voices." The word voices hung in the cold air between us. On the first night, we'd heard something that sounded like Charles calling out, calling for help, his voice twisted and strained. Charles had been in the tent next to mine at the time. We'd heard him call from the forest, but he was asleep 5 feet away. When we woke him up, he had no memory of leaving the tent. He claimed he'd been dreaming, but his boots had been by the fire and his feet had been muddy. On the second night, it was a woman's voice. Then Jack Flores's voice. Then multiple voices, overlapping, creating conversations that almost made sense but fell apart whenever you tried to actually listen to them. By the 3rd night, we'd stopped investigating. We just lay in our tents and listened. "Charles wants to move camp today," Owen said. "He says we should head back toward the trailhead, cut the trip short by a few days." I nodded. This made sense. This was the right thing to do. "But Penelope thinks we should push deeper," Owen continued. "She says we've already committed to this route, that turning back would be wasteful." Penelope Washington, 31 years old, some kind of financial advisor. She had a way of talking that made terrible ideas sound rational. On the 2nd day of the hike, she'd convinced us all to take a shorter water route instead of the longer, well-marked trail. The shorter route would save us 1.5 miles. What it had actually done was take us past 3 old structures, a collapsed barn, the remains of what might have been a cabin, and something that looked like it had been a church once, with a rusted iron cross still standing in the overgrown clearing. "What do you think?" I asked Owen. He was quiet for a long moment. When he answered, his voice was different, smaller, like something had been taken out of it. "I think something is wrong with the way we're thinking about this situation," he said. "I think we're trying to fix it with the normal part of our brains, but the problem isn't in the normal part of the world anymore." I understood what he meant. even though the words didn't quite make sense. Because he was right. Somewhere between the first night and now, the world had changed. The rules had changed. And we were operating on old instincts, old knowledge, trying to solve a problem that existed in a different dimension of reality than the one we were trained to understand. "I'm going back to the tent," I said. Owen didn't respond. He just stood there, looking out at the breathing forest, and I wondered if he was still entirely Owen Patterson anymore, or if something had started replacing him in the night. The coffee in my cup had gone cold. By the 6th day, the mountain had started to change its geography. This sounds impossible. I know it sounds impossible, but it's what happened. The trail we'd been following curved in directions I didn't remember from our previous days. Landmarks appeared that none of us had seen before, even though we'd supposedly hiked past those areas already. A cluster of white birches, a particular formation of rocks that looked like a face, a dry riverbed that cut perpendicular to our path and seemed to go on for miles in both directions. Charles had called a meeting that morning around the camp stove. All 9 of us sat in a circle on the cold ground, our breath creating ghosts in the mountain air. The sun was up, but it was the wrong color of up, a gray, diffused light that made it impossible to tell what time of day it actually was. "We need to talk about our route," Charles said. His voice had changed too. His confidence had eroded, replaced by something that sounded like hunger. "According to my calculations, we should have reached Whitmore Ridge by now, but I don't recognize the terrain." Julian Butler, 32, an architect from Atlanta, pulled out a map. "We can triangulate using the peaks," he said. He'd taken over navigation duties after Owen had stopped sleeping. "The elevation markers should give us—" "The markers are wrong," Levi Foster interrupted. Levi was 34, a forest ranger, and before this trip, I would have said he was the only person in our group who genuinely understood these mountains. "I've worked the eastern ridges for 6 years. I know the elevation profiles. That peak to the northwest should be marked as 4,200 feet, but I counted the contour lines. It's showing 3,800. "The map is old," Julian said. "Could be a printing error." "The map is 3 years old," Levi said. "These mountains don't change elevation in 3 years." Riley Simmons was the youngest of us, 19 years old, a college kid who'd only joined the trip because Jack Flores was his older brother. He'd been mostly quiet, mostly trying to be small and unnoticed. Now he was crying. Not loud, just tears running down his face while he stared at a piece of jerky he'd been pretending to eat. "We're lost," Aria Gonzalez said matter-of-factly. Aria was 35, a former park ranger herself, which was probably why Levi had been listening to her more than anyone else. "We're lost, and the environment is systematically preventing us from reorienting." "That's not possible," Hazel said. "The environment can't. That's not how geology or botany work. Terrain doesn't shift. Trees don't rearrange themselves. We're either reading our maps wrong, or our instruments are malfunctioning, or we're experiencing some kind of mass psychological event." "Is there a difference?" Penelope asked. "If the effect is the same regardless of the cause, does the source matter?" No one answered her. On the second night, Perry Chen had died. Perry Chen was 25, Kelly's ex-girlfriend, though Kelly had been the 25-year-old to everyone's knowledge before we realized there had been 2 Kellys in the group. No, that wasn't right. There had only ever been one Kelly. She was 15, Kelly's daughter. That was the thing that had broken the last of our coherence as a group. On the morning of day 4, we'd realized that Kelly wasn't just a name on the roster, she was an actual person, and she was a child. And she'd been hiking for 4 days through increasingly unstable terrain with the rest of us. No one could quite remember who had brought her. It seemed like someone had mentioned it was fine, that she was experienced, that she would be okay. But who, and when had anyone ever agreed to allow a child on this trip? Perry had asked too many questions about it. Perry had wanted to end the trip and get Kelly out of the mountains immediately. Perry had said that this was insane, that someone had made a serious error in judgment, that we all needed to take responsibility for. Perry had walked away from camp around midnight on the 3rd night to process things. His words, "I need to walk. I need to process things." We found his shoes by the forest's edge in the morning. Just his shoes, nothing else. Charles had made the decision to keep going. "The thing that took Perry is more likely to let us alone if we keep moving," he'd said, and we'd all heard the lie in those words, but we'd believed him anyway because the alternative, stopping, waiting, being still, felt like death in a different form. "There's something on the ridgeline," Owen said suddenly, pulling us all back to the present moment and the terrible meeting around the camp stove. I've seen it 3 times now. It looks like a person, but the proportions are wrong. The legs are too long. The arms bend in places where arms shouldn't bend. The silence that followed felt physical. You didn't mention this, Levi said. I didn't think it was real, Owen replied. I thought I was losing my mind. We all are, Jack Flores said. Jack was 30, a high school teacher, and he'd been the one mostly in charge of keeping morale up with bad jokes and forced enthusiasm. Now he sounded hollow. We're all losing our minds. The question is whether we're doing it at the same rate or different rates. I've been having thoughts, Hazel said, and I know it's just the stress and the fear, but I've been thinking about the stories, the old Cherokee stories, about what lives in these mountains. Don't, Arya said sharply. Skinwalkers, Hazel said anyway. That's what the stories call them. Humans who could wear animals like masks, who could call your voice in the dark because they'd heard it once, who got better at hunting once they'd tracked you for a while, who— Stop, I heard myself say. But Hazel had the momentum of someone saying something they'd been holding in for days. Who could change the land around them because they understood it at a level that human minds weren't supposed to understand? Who could make you lose your way even on familiar ground? Who could make you doubt whether your own senses were reliable? That's mythology, Julian said, but his voice shook. Maybe, Hazel said. Or maybe the mythology is just documentation. Maybe people saw things they couldn't explain and invented a framework to contain them. Maybe the stories are warnings encoded as folklore. That night we set up a rotation watch, all 9 of us, taking 2-hour shifts. No one would be alone. No one would sleep deeply. We would keep the fire going and watch the ridgeline where Owen had seen the shape with the wrong proportions. At 2 a.m. during my watch, I heard the voice again. It came from beyond the tree line, from deep in the forest in the direction of the collapsed structures we'd passed days ago. It was my voice. It was saying things I was thinking, not things I'd said, things I'd thought, specific memories, specific moments of doubt and fear and shame. My voice in the darkness, speaking my own psychology back at me like a prayer to something that had learned to read minds. When the sun came up, nobody asked what I'd heard. We all knew. By the 8th day, we'd stopped trying to maintain the fiction that this was a normal hiking accident. We'd also stopped trying to escape. The realization crept up on us gradually, so we didn't all notice it at the same time. But somewhere between the day we last saw the marked trail and the day we stopped looking for it, we'd unconsciously agreed that leaving was impossible. Not physically, the forest was still around us, open in every direction, navigable in theory. But something about the way the trees arranged themselves, the way the ridgelines curved back toward our camp, no matter which direction we started walking, had convinced us that the mountain had made a decision about us. We were staying. The thing that took Perry had visited us twice more. We'd seen it differently each time. The first time, it appeared at the edge of firelight as something that might have been a mountain lion, except the face was wrong, too intelligent, too aware. Its eyes caught the reflected fire and held our gaze with a presence that made my skin feel like it was trying to separate from my body. The second time, it wore the shape of something between an eagle and a wolf. Impossible architecture, impossible biology. Standing at the tree line on its 2 long legs, its head turning to follow each of us as we moved around the camp. On the 8th night, it came to us in a shape that made Levi scream, until his voice broke entirely, a scream that became voiceless afterward, like something had torn the function out of his throat. It had worn Levi's own face, not an approximation, an exact replica, down to the small scar on his left cheekbone, down to the specific pattern of his hair. It had stood at the fire's edge, looking at all of us with Levi's eyes, and opened its mouth to produce a sound that Levi would never be able to make himself. That was when Owen attacked it. Owen had kept a knife, a long-bladed hunting knife, that he'd maintained religiously through all of this. When the thing wearing Levi's face emerged from the darkness, Owen moved with the clarity of someone who'd been training for this moment. He drove the blade deep into the creature's shoulder. For a moment, it felt like we might be winning. The thing screamed a sound that had nothing to do with Levi's voice or any human throat. It exploded outward, its shape fragmenting, becoming a shadow that seemed to exist in the spaces between our perceptions. We couldn't quite see it, but we could see the negative space where it disrupted the normal reality around it. It moved through the camp like that, and where it passed, things changed. Jack Flores changed. The transformation was fast, but not instant. His skin began to shift and run like water while he was still conscious. He tried to run, but his legs couldn't agree on which direction was down. His mouth opened to scream, but the sound that came out was layered his voice, an animal's roar, a sound like wind through a cavern. When the reshaping finished, Jack wasn't dead. He was just different. He'd assumed a shape that was close to human but noticeably off, the way a child's drawing of a person is the wrong proportions, the wrong angles. He looked at us with an expression of profound confusion and pain, and then he fled into the forest on limbs that weren't quite coordinated to his nervous system's expectations. We didn't try to follow him. By the 9th day, Charles had stopped speaking entirely. He would mouth words sometimes, as if practicing conversations he'd never actually have. His eyes tracked something that the rest of us couldn't see, or couldn't admit we were seeing. Penelope had become focused on a new mission. She was trying to reason with it. A creature like this has motivations, she'd insisted, sitting close to the fire while the rest of us gave her space. It's hunting us because we're intruding, or because it's feeding, or because we've threatened its territory. But those are understandable motivations. We can work with understandable motivations. We can negotiate. It doesn't want to negotiate, Arya said quietly. If negotiation were possible, it would have ended this already. Then what does it want? Penelope demanded. No one answered, because we all knew. It wanted to understand us. It wanted to wear our shapes. It wanted to learn the specific texture of human consciousness so it could imitate it perfectly. And it had all the time it needed. We were trapped in its laboratory, and the mountain was the walls. On the 10th day, Riley Simmons tried to leave. His brother Jack, the human-shaped one, not the one wearing Jack's skin, had tried to stop him. But Riley was young and desperate and moving with the particular clarity that comes from deciding you'd rather die attempting to escape than slowly dissolve in place. He made it as far as we could see, about 100 meters through the tree line. Then the forest rearranged itself. Not dramatically. Just slightly. Just enough that when Riley reached what should have been clear ground, his feet found a slope he hadn't seen. He fell, tumbling down an incline that definitely hadn't existed 15 seconds before. We could hear him falling for much longer than physics would suggest was necessary for a fall that short. When the sound finally stopped, we didn't go look for him. Arya used it as a moment to make her decision. She came to me while I was sitting alone, ostensibly watching the forest but actually lost in a state of apprehensive numbness. I'm going to try to understand it, she said. Like Penelope, but differently. I'm going to walk into the forest and observe what it does. I'm going to gather information. And when I come back, if I come back, I'm going to figure out what we're actually dealing with. That's suicide, I told her. So is staying, she replied. She walked out of camp at dawn on the 11th day and didn't come back. By that point, there were only 5 of us left. Me, Nora, Owen, Hazel, and Julian. Charles had stopped being Charles. Penelope had stopped being entirely communicative. She just stared into space and sometimes whispered numbers in a sequence that made my teeth ache to listen to. Owen was still bleeding. The knife wound he'd received during the creature's escape had become infected with something that wasn't quite normal infection. The flesh around the cut had begun to show colors that flesh doesn't come in. He wrapped it obsessively, but the bandages were running out, and soon he'd have to choose between leaving it exposed or binding it with cloth that was already contaminated. It's going to try to wear me, Owen said one evening as we sat watching the impossible sky fade into impossible darkness. I can feel it happening. It's like it's learning my shape from the inside, learning how my muscles work, learning how I think. Soon I won't be able to tell which thoughts are mine and which are its. You're still here, Nora said. Her voice was nearly gone. She'd been screaming, though we'd all learned to ignore it. That means something, does it? Owen asked. Or does it just mean it hasn't finished yet? He walked into the forest that night while we slept. We found a single knife lying on the ground in the morning, Owen's knife, the one he'd used against the creature. Just the knife, nothing else. By the 12th day, the 5 of us had become the final 4. The creature began to communicate with us through mimicry that went beyond simple voice replication. It would create images in the smoke of the fire. It would arrange the stones around our camp into patterns that almost resolved into meaning. It would speak in fragments of our conversations, mixing and matching our words until certain sentences emerged that felt like they might be comprehensible if we just listened correctly. Hazel had become obsessed with recording these fragments. She had a notebook that she filled with the sounds the creature made, with rough phonetic translations, with her own theories about the structure of its language. She'd stopped sleeping almost entirely, just sat by the fire and listened and wrote and tried to construct an alphabet from an alphabet that might not even exist. "It's teaching us," she said, and I couldn't tell if she was delirious or if she'd actually discovered something. "It's teaching us how it thinks, how it perceives reality. If we learn its language, we can communicate. We can establish boundaries. We can survive this." "Or it's learning from us how we think," Julian countered. "Every piece of information we give it, every assumption we make about its cognition, that's just more data it can use to refine its human impression." But Hazel kept writing. Penelope had started walking toward the forest every morning at dawn. We stopped trying to stop her after the second day. She'd walk out into the trees, disappear for hours, and then she'd reappear at camp late in the afternoon, moving slowly, never explaining where she'd been or what she'd experienced. On one of these days, I followed her. I tracked her through the forest carefully, staying just far enough back that I wouldn't lose sight of her. The path she took was becoming more defined each time, as if the mountain was making a corridor specifically for her use. She walked for almost 2 hours, and then the forest opened, and I saw what she'd been walking toward. There was a structure in the clearing, not ancient, not quite modern, but existing in some temporal space between the two. It looked almost like a house, but the geometry was wrong. The angles suggested dimensions that three-dimensional space shouldn't be able to contain. Windows looked out in directions that didn't correspond to walls. The creature was standing in front of it. It wore a shape I hadn't seen before, something that was superficially human but built wrong, the proportions exaggerated to make it clear that this was a copy, not an original. Like looking at a fashion model of human anatomy. Every feature slightly too tall, slightly too pronounced, slightly too aware of its own presentation. Penelope walked up to it and took its hand. They went inside the structure together. I don't know how long I stood at the forest's edge. Time was working differently up here. I could have been watching for minutes or hours. When I finally moved, it was to back away slowly, to retrace her path, to return to our camp without being seen. That night, Penelope came back to us. She was unchanged physically, but something had shifted in her eyes. She sat with us, ate the food we offered her, responded to our questions with perfect normalcy, and slowly, it became clear that she wasn't Penelope anymore. She was the creature's impression of Penelope, close enough that you could almost believe she was the original, but there were tells. She never quite made the expressions Penelope had made. She understood our jokes intellectually, but didn't find them funny in the way that Penelope would have. She remembered facts about Penelope's life, but not the emotional weight those memories carried. It was like watching someone wear a suit that almost fit. "You're going to try to kill me," she said to me on the 14th day, when Nora and Julian had gone to collect water and Hazel was asleep. "The rest of you are going to eventually realize that what's standing in front of you isn't a human being anymore, and you're going to decide to execute it as a mercy, as a way to stop the creature from learning anything more through me." She was right. I could see exactly how that conversation would go. The vote, the sudden clarity that this was no longer Penelope, the decision that action was necessary. "It won't matter," she continued. "The creature knows everything I know. It's already gotten everything useful from me. Killing me won't stop it. It will just be another data point in its research, another way that humans behave, another instinct it can add to its understanding." "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Because you're going to be the one who makes the decision," she said. "And I thought you deserved to know that it's not actually a decision. Not really. The outcome is already determined. The creature is already inside all of us now. We're all just slowly becoming its collection, its library, its record of what it means to be human." I wanted to argue with her. I wanted to tell her that we'd find a way out, that someone would come looking for us, that this would end. But I'd stopped believing in those things a long time ago. When Nora and Julian came back to camp, I didn't tell them about the conversation. I didn't tell them that I could feel something shifting inside my own perception. That I wasn't entirely sure whether my thoughts were my own thoughts or whether they were something the creature was thinking through my neural pathways. Hazel kept writing in her notebook. She'd filled it almost completely by day 15. The entries had become less analytical and more frantic. Entire pages of the same word repeated hundreds of times. Sketches that started as attempted diagrams and devolved into chaotic scratching. Fragments of sentences that seemed to be in languages that didn't exist. I'm getting close, she told me. I can feel it. The logic system is starting to resolve. If I can just understand the base framework, I can communicate with it. I can ask it why. I can ask it what it wants. I can ask it if there's a way to end this. Maybe, I said, knowing I was lying. The problem, she continued, is that understanding its logic might require me to stop thinking like a human. It might require me to reorganize the fundamental way I perceive reality. And once I do that, I might not be able to come back. She looked at me with a clarity that suggested she'd already made her decision. But staying here and not trying isn't really better, she said. At least if I try, there's a chance. She stayed awake all night, writing, muttering, testing sounds in her mouth like she was practicing a language that had never been meant for a human throat. By morning, she wasn't quite herself anymore. On the 17th day, Julian tried to draw a map. His hands shook as he worked, creating a representation of the terrain around our camp. But something had gone wrong with his visual perception. The map didn't match reality. The camp was in the wrong place. The mountains curved in directions that contradicted each other. The distances couldn't possibly be accurate, because they added up to numbers that were too large for the actual space. It's changing faster now, Julian said, staring at his own map like it was a confession written in a language he didn't understand. The landscape. It's not subtle anymore. It's actively rearranging itself, and we're part of the rearrangement. Our presence here is, we're not observers anymore. We're part of the terrain. I understood what he meant, even though the words were impossible. The mountain was consuming us. Not in the way that most predators consume prey. There was no eating, no digestion in the traditional sense. But we were becoming integrated into the structure of the place. Our thoughts were becoming part of its thought process. Our existence was becoming part of the ecosystem's consciousness. Nora had stopped sleeping entirely. She would sit and stare at nothing, and occasionally her mouth would move, as if she was speaking to something that existed between thoughts, in the spaces where consciousness frayed out into something else. "We're going to die here," she said to me once, and her voice had the certainty of someone speaking a known fact. "We're going to die here, but we're not going to stop existing. We're going to become part of the mountain's memory. We're going to become the stories it tells when it finds the next group of humans. We're going to become the voices it uses to call them deeper into the forest." I didn't tell her that I'd already accepted this, that somewhere around day 12, I'd stopped fighting and started waiting to see what would happen, that the fear had transitioned into a kind of numb resignation, that I was already starting to feel the edges of my identity becoming fuzzy. On the 18th day, something happened that shouldn't have been possible. We found a way out. Not an escape. Not exactly. But there was a direction that, when we walked it, didn't lead back to where we started. There was a ridgeline that didn't curve back toward our camp. There was a trail marker, an actual white-painted blaze on a tree that appeared as if it had always been there, as if we'd simply failed to notice it before. Julian saw it first. "We can leave," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's letting us leave." We stared at that white mark for a long time. "It's not letting us do anything," Nora said. "It's showing us the exit because it's done with us, because we've given it everything useful, because we're not valuable as research anymore." But she was already moving toward the trail. We didn't make the decision together to actually go. It just happened. One moment we were at the camp, and the next moment we were walking, following the white blazes down a trail that was becoming more defined with every step, more real, less like something the mountain was tolerating, and more like something that had always existed. The trail was familiar as we descended. I recognized formations I'd seen on the first day. I recognized the structure of the landscape. By the time we reached the collapsed barn, the one we'd passed on the shortcut Penelope had convinced us to take, I knew we were really leaving. There was an actual road at the trail's end. A ranger station stood about 100 meters away, its windows dark, but its structure unmistakably real, unmistakably part of the human world. Julian reached the road first and stood there, staring at the asphalt like it was the most impossible thing he'd ever seen. "How long were we up there?" he asked. I didn't have an answer. My watch had stopped working on day 3. There was no way to know if we'd been in those mountains for 3 weeks or 3 months. The sun had been wrong. Time had been wrong. The only certainty was that we'd been there long enough for something fundamental to change in how we perceived reality. We walked toward the ranger station. Inside, we found a log, a visitor log. On the last entry, written in handwriting I recognized, were names. All 9 of our names. But the dates were wrong. The entry was from 3 years ago. That's not possible, Julian said, but I could see the other entries now, looking at the log more carefully. I could see other groups, other visitors, other sets of names, with dates that spanned years, decades. Some of them were marked with small red check marks. Some had notes in the margins: missing, search called off, presumed lost, recovery unfeasible, route deemed unsafe. I found another entry from 10 years ago. It had names I didn't recognize, but it also had one name I did: Levi Foster. The same Levi Foster who was currently asleep at our camp, or not asleep, just existing in the state that Levi had been existing in for the last few days. Except he'd died up there. I could have sworn he'd died, or maybe the Levi who'd walked out of the mountains 3 years ago had gone back. Maybe, once the creature had learned from you, it had let you leave, and then it had called you back years later, and you'd gone, because you'd never actually left mentally. You'd just been walking around in the human world as a hollow version of yourself, waiting for the mountain to call you back so you could return to your true purpose, which was to become part of its story, to become the voice it used to call others deeper, to become the thing that convinced the next group that the mountain was safe. The next group would meet us on the trail, and we'd tell them we'd hiked it 100 times. We'd assure them the stories were exaggerated. We'd suggest the routes we'd taken. We'd smile at them with expressions that weren't quite right, and they'd dismiss their misgivings because we seemed almost human, almost believable. "We need to leave," Nora said urgently. "We need to leave right now and never come back." We walked back to the road. We flagged down a vehicle, a truck driven by an actual human, a ranger whose consciousness was entirely his own and hadn't been thinned or touched by the presence of the mountain. He drove us to the nearest town. He asked questions. We gave answers. We told him we'd gotten lost, that we'd turned back when the trail became unclear, that we were fine, just needed some food and rest and a hot shower. He didn't believe us entirely, but he accepted our story and dropped us at a gas station where we could use the phone to call for help. The original group had been 9 people. Only 4 of us left the mountains. 6 months have passed since we walked out of those mountains. I'm writing this account in the safety of an apartment in Knoxville, Tennessee, far from the Appalachian ridges. Julian and Nora are both still alive, and as far as I can tell, they're entirely themselves. We see each other occasionally. We don't talk about what happened up there. Hazel Hughes was found by search and rescue teams, about 8 miles from our camp, in a state of severe psychological distress. She's been in a facility for the past half year. The staff says she's improving, but when I visited her once, and only once, I saw the way her eyes tracked something that wasn't there, the way her lips moved around sounds that weren't meant for human throats. They're keeping her sedated most of the time. I haven't heard anything about Charles or Penelope. The official report listed them as missing, presumed lost to the mountain terrain. There was a search effort for about 2 weeks before they called it off. The terrain was deemed too unstable for a full recovery effort. The families were offered condolences. Owen and Jack and Riley and Aria were never found, but I see Owen sometimes. Not in person, not exactly. But I'll be walking through Knoxville, and I'll see someone in my peripheral vision, someone with Owen's height, Owen's gait, Owen's way of moving. And when I turn to look, there's just an ordinary person, nothing remarkable, nothing that would distinguish them from any other hiker or camper or wilderness enthusiast, except their eyes are tracking something on the ridgeline, tracking the mountains, waiting for the season to turn. Nora experienced something similar. She saw Jack Flores, the real Jack, or a perfect version of him, at a grocery store about 2 months after we got out. He was buying supplies, mountaineering supplies. The conversation lasted about 30 seconds. Jack asked how she was. She said she was fine. He said he was heading back up to the mountains to finish the hike they'd started. When she tried to tell people about it, they explained that she must have been mistaken, that grief and trauma were playing tricks on her perception, that the human mind was expert at constructing false memories when processing significant events. But I believe her, because I've started having the dreams. In the dreams, I'm walking up the mountain again. The trail is clear. The weather is perfect. The forest is beautiful in a way that almost breaks my heart. And I'm looking for someone. I can never quite remember who, but I know it's important. I know they're waiting for me up there. And I can almost feel the moment when I'm going to remember exactly who it is that I'm looking for, and I'm going to turn around and start walking, and I'm never going to come back. The dreams are becoming more frequent. Last week I woke up and realized I'd been packing. I had a backpack sitting by my bed, filled with hiking supplies, and I had no memory of purchasing any of it. The credit card statement says I bought it 2 weeks ago, but I have no recollection of making that purchase. I threw everything away. But sometimes I think about going back, not to escape anything, not to save anyone, just to understand the final pieces of what happened up there, just to finish the work that Hazel started, to complete the translation of the language that the creature was trying to teach us. Because I have a suspicion that if we could actually understand what it wanted, what it was trying to communicate, we might discover that the thing in the mountains isn't actually an enemy. It's something that exists in a different mode of consciousness than we do, and it's not trying to destroy us or consume us. It's trying to welcome us. It's trying to show us what it means to exist without the limitation of individual identity. To live in a state where the boundaries between self and environment, between thought and reality, between observer and observed, are all dissolved. And maybe the creature's hunting of us wasn't predatory at all. Maybe it was just trying to teach us how to live like it does. The white blazes are appearing on trees near my apartment. I see them sometimes when I'm walking. They lead toward the mountains. They're not visible to anyone else, I think. People walk past them without noticing, but I notice. And every day, the pull to follow them gets a little stronger. My name was going to be left out of the rescue reports. The investigators wanted to know why. Wanted to know if I was ashamed of surviving when others didn't. I told them it was simply that I wanted privacy. I wanted to move on. I wanted to leave this part of my life entirely in the past. But the truth is more complicated. The truth is that I'm not entirely sure I ever left. The truth is that I remember drinking from a stream on day 15, and the water tasted like something that was learning the shape of thirst. I remember eating berries that the forest had grown specifically for us. I remember the sensation of something reaching into my mind and taking inventory of my thoughts like a creature organizing a library. And I'm not entirely sure that the person who walked out of those mountains was the person who walked in. I'm not entirely sure that there's such a thing as walking out when the thing has learned your shape completely, when it understands the pattern of your thoughts well enough to predict your every decision, when it has literally written you into the landscape. The dreams are different now. In the most recent ones, I'm not walking up the mountain alone. There are others with me, people I recognize but can't quite place. Owen is there. Arya is there. A man who might be Riley, though he's aged 20 years and a night. And at the head of the group, leading us deeper into the forest, is a figure with a familiar face. It's wearing my face. It's the version of me that chose to stay. The version that said yes to the mountain instead of no. The version that understood what was being offered and accepted it fully. And in the dreams, I know exactly what's going to happen next. The other me is going to turn around and extend its hand. It's going to ask me to join them. It's going to explain that the hike was never supposed to end, that the mountain was never something to be conquered or escaped, that the true journey only begins once you understand that you're not a visitor in the forest. You're a resident. You're becoming part of the ecosystem's consciousness. You're becoming the mountain itself. And I know, with the absolute certainty that comes from a truth too deep to be questioned, that I'm going to take that hand. Because the mountain's call is patient. Because the mountains will always be there, waiting, with the white blazes to guide me. Because the version of me that stayed behind is slowly teaching the version of me that walked away exactly how to feel at home in the terrible, beautiful, impossible landscape of a consciousness that spans miles of wilderness and centuries of stone. I think I'll leave tomorrow. I think I've finally accepted what's been slowly becoming inevitable since the moment we first stepped onto that trail. I think I'm going to walk back into the mountains. And this time, I'm not coming back out. The creature got everything it needed from me, and now I'm finally going to get what it's been trying to teach me all along. How to stop being individual, how to become part of something larger, how to cease being human and become instead something that wears humanity like a mask, until even the memory of ever being anything else fades away completely. The mountains are calling, and I'm finally ready to answer. You know how sometimes the internet swallows certain stories without explanation? How some forums get scrubbed, some threads deleted, some witness accounts simply vanish into digital dust? I'm reaching out now because there's a statute of limitations on silence, and I've been quiet long enough. This isn't a creepypasta. This isn't Reddit fiction crafted for updates. 9 years ago, 11 of us drove into the Appalachian wilderness near the Black Forest region of northern Pennsylvania with the intention of creating memories. We came back with scars we still don't speak about, and one of us didn't come back at all. My name isn't important. But what happened to Ryan, Stella, Nathan, Lucy, Isaac, Aurora, Caleb, Ellie, Thomas, Violet, and Kelly is something you need to hear. I'm recording this for you now because the truth deserves to outlive the people who lived it. We set out on a Friday in late October when the Appalachian Mountains bleed red and gold. I remember the drive vividly, 5 vehicles winding through roads that grew progressively narrower, more isolate, until cell service became an intermittent ghost and the only sounds were tire on asphalt and wind through dead leaves. Ryan Sanders was the architect of this expedition, 16 years old with the kind of arrogance that comes from never having experienced true consequence. He'd read about the old hiking trails near the Black Forest routes that predated modern park development, paths that the original settlers had used to traverse the ridgelines before Appalachia swallowed most of what they'd built. "It'll be epic," he kept saying. "Raw, authentic. No one goes out here anymore." He was right about that last part, though he didn't understand why. None of us did. Stella Price, 17, was the skeptic of our group. She kept asking practical questions. Had anyone filed a route plan with the ranger station? Did we have emergency supplies? But she came anyway, because Stella had this quality where skepticism masqueraded as caution, and caution always lost to loyalty. She brought her older brother's satellite messenger, a device that would later become the only reason anyone ever believed our story. Nathan Bennett, 18, was the kind of person who existed in the spaces between other people's conversations, quiet, observant. He took photographs obsessively, documenting everything with a digital camera he'd saved for months to purchase. The images from that trip would later be examined by people far beyond our circle, analyzed for inconsistencies, dissected in whispered forums. They're still consistent. That's the part that haunts the people who've seen them. Lucy Wood carried a leather journal. 19 years old, she had this habit of narrating her own experiences as though she were writing about them in real time, which she was. Every evening, she'd sit by the fire and scribble observations. Those journals are gone now, destroyed. By whom, I'll never know, but I suspect they knew truths that weren't meant to be permanently recorded. Isaac Barnes was the physically strongest among us. 20 years old, he'd grown up in the surrounding counties, and his presence lent credibility to the expedition. "I've hiked these ridges before," he'd told us. But later, I realized he'd never ventured this far north, never gone deep enough into the real wilderness. His strength couldn't protect us from that. Aurora Ross was the last one we picked up before the ranger station road, a 21-year-old woman from the small town of Driftless, who'd somehow heard about our trip and insisted on joining. There was something strange about Aurora. She never quite explained how she knew about the expedition. She'd been waiting at the roadside diner, as though she already knew we were coming. Caleb Henderson, Ellie Coleman, and Thomas Jenkins formed a unit unto themselves, 3 20-somethings who'd been friends since childhood, connected by the kind of bond that only forms in isolated rural communities. They brought the heavy equipment, 4-season tents, freeze-dried provisions, a small portable stove that would become useless in the cold that descended like an ambush predator. And then there was Violet Perry, the oldest among us at 25. She'd done serious hiking mountain expeditions in Colorado, backcountry treks in Montana. She was supposed to be the experienced one. She was supposed to keep us safe. And Kelly, 15 years old, the youngest. She was Ryan's cousin, and he'd brought her without telling the rest of us. She'd run away from home 3 times already, and this trip seemed like the kind of controlled chaos that Ryan assumed would be therapeutic. He was desperately, catastrophically wrong. We established base camp on the evening of the first day in a clearing that seemed almost too perfect, a flat expanse surrounded by towering pines, with a small stream running nearby. Nathan documented it with his camera. Stella marked it on her GPS. I stood at the perimeter and felt, for the first time, that particular cold that comes from being watched by things that don't have names. Violet said it first. "This place feels wrong." But we were young and stupid and convinced that we were the apex predators of this wilderness. We were catastrophically mistaken. By the second day, the forest had started doing things that forests shouldn't do. The hiking trail we'd planned to follow, clearly marked on 2 separate maps, one of them decades old, seemed to have become obscured by growth that looked far too recent. Pine needles accumulated in drifts across the path as though deliberately placed. Branches hung across walkways at precisely the height of a man's face, creating barriers that forced us to constantly duck and weave. Natural, Isaac insisted. This happens. Wind, growth, erosion. But nothing about it felt natural. We made slow progress. What should have been a 6-hour hike became an 8-hour ordeal, and by the time we stopped for lunch at a rocky outcropping, everyone was exhausted and irritable. Stella checked the satellite messenger twice, ensuring the signal was reaching through the canopy, that our location was being transmitted to the outside world, that we weren't somehow falling off the edge of mapped reality. Thomas cracked a joke about the forest actively trying to prevent us from advancing. Everyone laughed, but it was the kind of nervous laughter that means you've all thought the same thing and are grateful someone said it first. It was during lunch that we first heard the sounds, not distinctly at first, just an ambient wrongness in the audio landscape, a quality of sound that didn't match the environment. Stella described it later as the forest clearing its throat. Too many consonants for the normal soundscape of wind and leaves. Rhythmic, intentional. Nathan's camera captured them. When the footage was reviewed afterward, it showed something like movement in the forest, periphery shapes that didn't quite resolve into clarity, that seemed to shift when directly observed, but were perfectly distinct at the edges of the frame. An animal, Caleb said, but his voice had risen half an octave. Bears? Ellie asked, looking to Isaac. Black bears avoid groups this size. They hear us, they leave. But these weren't behaving like bears. They were flanking us, moving in parallel to our path when we resumed hiking, keeping pace. Aurora hadn't spoken all morning. She'd walked with mechanical precision, her eyes fixed on the trail ahead, her breathing steady and controlled. When Violet asked if she was okay, Aurora turned and smiled, and that smile contained something that made the temperature of my perception drop several degrees. Fine, she said. Just attentive. By evening, we'd covered less than half the planned distance. We established a secondary camp in another clearing, this one smaller, less hospitable, surrounded by the kind of undergrowth that suggested the forest was actively closing in on us. The sun seemed to set faster than it should have, as though the day was being compressed. While the others set up tents, I walked the perimeter with Violet. She was quiet in a way that suggested she was calculating probabilities and not liking the results. We should turn back in the morning, she said quietly. The others won't agree, I know, but we should. That night, the sounds intensified. They started around midnight. Vocalizations that originated from the tree line but didn't quite sound like anything with a larynx should sound. Not quite animal, not quite human. Existing in the uncanny valley between the two, with harmonic overtones that made your teeth ache if you listened too long. Kelly cried, quietly, under her breath, so her cousin Ryan wouldn't hear and shame her for it. But I heard. Stella heard. We all heard. The sounds circled the camp 3 times during the night, each pass closer than the last. The fire was struggling to stay alive. Wood that should have burned well seemed resistant, emitting more smoke than heat, the flames pale and insufficient. And then, around 4 in the morning, the circling stopped. There was instead a sudden and total silence. No insects, no distant animal sounds, no wind. Just the breathing of 11 terrified people in a clearing surrounded by a forest that had become a place of active, intentional malevolence. In that silence, we heard something else. A voice. Not overlapped, not imagined. A voice that came from no single direction, that seemed to originate from the forest as a unified entity. Come out. Just those 2 words, in English, spoken with an accent that belonged to no ethnicity, no region, no human origin point I could identify. Isaac drew a hunting knife. Caleb reached for the fire tool, a long iron poker used to manipulate the burning wood. Thomas pulled his phone out with the hopeless gesture of someone checking for signal that he knew wasn't there. The voice didn't return, but the presence did a weight in the darkness that we could all feel pressing against the fragile perimeter of our firelight. When dawn finally came, filtering through the canopy in thin, anemic rays, none of us had slept. We existed in a collective state of exhausted adrenaline, waiting for someone to suggest we leave. No one did. We pressed deeper on the 3rd day, which I still don't fully understand. Looking back, it feels like a decision we were being shepherded toward, like dominoes that had been set up by something with far more patience and far more intimate knowledge of how fear and pride interact in the human psyche. The forest changed as we moved north and higher in elevation. The trees became ancient twisted pines and hemlock with trunks that had to be centuries old. They grew in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, creating natural corridors that channeled us forward while creating barriers to lateral movement. It was Stella who first voiced what everyone was thinking. It's like we're on a path that was already here, already planned. She was right. The forest wasn't just difficult to navigate through. It was navigation through a structure, a predetermined route that funneled our group along a specific trajectory, and that trajectory was leading us somewhere. Around midday, we reached what I can only describe as a threshold. The forest opened into a vast clearing, perhaps 300 yards across, and in the center of that clearing stood something that didn't belong, a structure, not a building, exactly, not a cairn. It was composed of what appeared to be bones, large bones, stacked in a geometric pattern that created an archway approximately 15 feet tall and 12 feet wide. The silence that greeted this discovery was absolute. Nathan moved toward it with his camera, documenting the structure with the methodical precision of someone who understood that this was beyond normal and required documentation. No one stopped him. We all moved closer, drawn by a combination of morbid fascination and the mounting terror that suggests proximity to something catastrophic. The bones were old, weathered, pale by decades of exposure. Some were the size of human femurs, others were smaller. In the center of the archway, carved into what appeared to be a large skull, was a symbol. Parallel lines creating a shape that was neither wholly geometric nor wholly organic. "This is a grave marker," Violet said, "or something that has that function." Caleb was examining the ground. "Look at the soil. It's been disturbed, recently, within the last few months." "Who builds something like this?" Kelly asked. Her voice was small, and Ryan put his arm around her, which did nothing to reduce the reality of our situation. Aurora stepped through the archway. She moved with such casual confidence that none of us initially registered the violation of spatial relationships that followed. She'd walked through the bone structure, and on the other side, the forest looked different. The trees were denser, the shadows longer, the entire quality of light altered as though she'd stepped through a threshold into a different topographic reality. "Aurora," Violet called, "come back." Aurora turned. She smiled that same smile. "No," she said. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." And she walked into the forest on the far side of the archway, disappearing into the shadows with a finality that suggested she would never emerge. We should have recognized it in that moment, the signal, the moment when the machinery of something vast began operating in earnest. But we were still operating under the assumption that we were the primary actors in this narrative. Violet made the call to attempt the archway, to follow, to retrieve Aurora, to establish that our group remained whole. It was the impulse of a responsible leader, and it was precisely what was expected of us. The moment we stepped through, all 10 of us remaining together, a unit of fear and uncertainty and desperate hope, the forest behind us became a thing of memory. The path backward simply didn't exist anymore. The clearing behind the archway wasn't empty. It contained what appeared to be a settlement, though not one that belonged to the contemporary world. Structures composed of wood and bone and materials I couldn't identify were arranged in concentric circles around a central fire pit. They weren't ruins, they were occupied. We could sense the presence of habitation, the organization implied by purpose, the maintenance suggested by use, the particular quality of a place where intention is actively exerted. Aurora was standing in the center, near the fire pit. "Where is everyone?" Stella asked. The diner of her voice suggested she already knew the answer. "Here," Aurora replied. "We're always here." That's when I understood. Aurora wasn't Aurora anymore. Or perhaps she'd never been Aurora at all. The thing wearing her skin was operating the mechanics of her body with the precise understanding of someone who'd studied how humans moved and spoke and reasoned. But it was executing that study the way an actor executes a script, technically accurate, but fundamentally hollow. "What are you?" Nathan asked. He was still holding his camera, documenting evidence for a world that would never believe it. The Aurora thing didn't answer directly. Instead, it gestured toward the far edge of the clearing, where the forest gave way to what appeared to be a cliff face, though the darkness was so absolute that it was impossible to determine depth or distance. "This ridge has existed longer than the mountains it sits on," the Aurora thing said. "Before the forests, before the rivers, before the names the English settlers gave to these valleys. This is a place of convergence, where boundaries are thin." Caleb was backing away, pulling Ellie with him. "We need to go," Now. We cannot leave, the Aurora thing replied. The passages have closed. We exist only in the present tense, in this space, until the requirement has been fulfilled. What requirement? Violet demanded. The forest has appetites, it said, and it is hungry in ways you cannot comprehend. But hunger must be directed, channeled, transformed into a specific kind of attention. That requires witnesses. That requires those who can carry understanding back to the world of the living. Who? Lucy asked. She was holding her journal, but her pen had gone still. Which of us doesn't survive? The one who was never meant to be here, it said. Everyone's eyes went to Kelly. Ryan's reaction was immediate and violent. He lunged toward the thing wearing Aurora's face, a boy's strength fueled by family and protective instinct. His hands passed through air as the thing simply ceased to exist in the space where he was striking. It reappeared 20 feet away, still smiling that terrible smile. Not me, it corrected. The other. That's when we heard the vocalization again, the same impossible sound that had circled our camp night after night. But this time it didn't come from the forest. It came from multiple sources simultaneously, from the forest and the structures and the darkness itself, as though the place had finally stopped being subtle about what it was. They emerged from the trees around the perimeter of the clearing. I don't have adequate vocabulary to describe them. The human mind doesn't have templates for what those things were. They had the general morphology of humans bipedal, with arms and legs and a torso and a head, but the details were all wrong. The angles were too sharp. The proportions were slightly off in every possible dimension. They moved with a smooth, liquid grace that suggested their skeletal and muscular systems operated under different principles than ours. And their faces. The faces weren't fixed. They flickered between human and not human, cycling through expressions and features, as though they couldn't quite decide which configuration to settle into, or as though they could become any configuration they'd observed, could wear any human face they'd studied. Skinwalkers, Violet breathed. A term, one of them said, and it had cycled into the face of a man I recognized from news reports, someone who'd gone missing in these mountains in 1994. Not entirely inaccurate. But more accurately, we are the forest's attention, its intention, the mechanism by which it selects and learns. Ellie was crying. Thomas was praying in a voice so quiet it was barely above a whisper. Isaac's hunting knife, which had seemed so substantial in camp, looked like a child's toy. You exist because this place exists, another one said, and its face cycled through several configurations before settling into something that might have been female. You walk these ridges. You think you're masters of the terrain, but the terrain has been watching you, studying you, learning the patterns of your fear and your courage and your collapse. Let us leave, Stella said. We'll go back. We'll never speak of this. No one would believe us anyway. That, the first one said, is precisely why you'll survive. They separated us methodically, moving us into different structures with the kind of organized efficiency that suggested this wasn't their first processing of a human group. The places they took us to weren't cells, they were more like observation chambers, small circular spaces composed of wood and bone that seemed far larger inside than the external dimensions suggested. I was alone with Stella. The walls around us seemed to pulse with a faint phosphorescence that provided just enough light to see each other's faces, but not enough to see what might be in the shadows beyond our immediate perception. They're going to kill us, Stella said flatly. Maybe not. The thing said some of us would survive. Yes, some, not all. And I suspect we don't get to choose which. We sat in silence for what might have been hours. Time operated differently in that space. It felt both instantly present and stretched across ages. Without external references, without the sun's movement across the sky, it was impossible to track how long we were in that chamber. Then the doors opened, or perhaps the walls simply ceased to exist. The distinction seemed less relevant as the night progressed and we were herded back toward the central fire pit. The others were already assembled in a rough circle. 9 of us, plus the thing wearing Aurora's face, plus 5 of the creatures. Kelly was crying in Ryan's arms. His face was set into an expression of rage that couldn't manifest into action. One of the creatures circled us slowly, its face flickering between configurations with increasing rapidity. The forest has made a selection, it said. The one who was never meant to be here will serve as the point of convergence, the one through which the forest's attention will flow back into the world beyond the ridge. You can't have her, Ryan said. It's not a negotiation, another creature replied. It's a completion. There are rules that operate in this place, just as there are rules in the world you come from. One entity must remain as a bridge, one consciousness, transformed into something new, a channel, a witness from both sides of the threshold. What happens to her? Lucy asked. She becomes something that can exist in both spaces, neither human nor forest, but a translation between the two. In the world beyond, she will seem normal, entirely human. But she will be perpetually aware of us, of the ridges, of the hunger that operates beneath the surface of these mountains. She will carry the knowledge of what exists here, and that knowledge will shape how the world understands the wild places it thinks it controls. No, Kelly whimpered. She was trembling so violently that Ryan could barely hold her. The rest of you will return, the creature continued. You will go back through the archway. The path behind you will restore itself. You will emerge in a clearing not far from where you established your initial camp. You will have vague memories of 3 days of hiking. The details will be fuzzy, dreamlike. Others will assume trauma, exposure, psychological stress. Your narratives will be inconsistent. None of you will be able to provide concrete proof of where you were. Except for me, Nathan said quietly. He was holding the camera. I documented everything. Your documentation will show only what a camera can capture, the creature replied. Images of forest, tent, sky. The things that exist in both worlds look perfectly normal under human optics. Only your memories will conflict with what the images reveal, and memories, as you know, are notoriously unreliable. Stella was already moving. She lunged toward one of the creatures, her hand striking empty air as it cycled itself out of her reach. You're not taking any of us. We're a group. We came in together. No, the creature said. You came in together, but you did not enter together. One of you entered with a divided loyalty. One of you was always meant for this. The forest knew it when the group formed. That's why it appeared at the diner. That's why it insisted on joining an expedition into territory that its presence suggested should terrify anyone with genuine survival instinct. I looked at Kelly. She wasn't crying anymore. She was staring at the creatures with an expression of profound recognition, as though somewhere in her fractured teenage consciousness, she'd always known this was how her story would unfold. You were running away, one of the creatures said. Its face had settled into something neutral, almost kind, running from a life that felt insufficient, running toward a place where you might feel like you belonged. We offered you that belonging. So she agreed to this? Ryan asked. The betrayal in his voice was catastrophic. She knew, the creature replied, not explicitly, but part of her, the part that exists in the liminal space between childhood and adulthood, between the human world and something stranger, part of her knew. She's been halfway here her entire life. The creatures moved with liquid grace, encircling Kelly before anyone could intervene. The moment they surrounded her, the rest of us couldn't move. It was as though the space itself had become immobilized, keeping us as observers while the transformation occurred. It didn't hurt her, I think. The process was quick, almost gentle. One moment Kelly was a terrified 15-year-old girl. The next moment she was something else, still human-shaped, still superficially Kelly, but with something vast and ancient operating behind her eyes. She looked at us, and I realized we were no longer addressing the creatures. The creatures had become translucent, almost invisible, as though Kelly herself had become the point through which the forest was now observing us. You can go now, she said. Her voice was her voice, but it resonated with harmonics that human lungs shouldn't be able to produce. Go back through the archway. Don't look back. The path is opening. You have maybe 5 minutes before it closes again. Ryan tried to pull away from the others toward Kelly, but Violet grabbed him with a strength that suggested she'd been preparing for exactly this moment. She was already moving, pulling us toward the archway, which was becoming visible again at the far edge of the clearing. Come on, she commanded. Move. I looked back once. Kelly, or what Kelly had become, was standing in the center of the clearing, watching us with eyes that reflected the firelight in patterns that made no physical sense. The creatures were becoming more visible again, layering themselves around her like a living ecosystem. We ran. The return journey through the archway exists in my memory as a blur of motion and desperate effort. One moment we were in that clearing, watching Kelly transform into something that belonged to a place none of us had names for, and the next moment we were collapsing onto the forest floor in a landscape that was familiar but subtly wrong. The sun was rising. We were completely disoriented. None of us could determine how long we'd been in that place, whether it had been hours or days. Stella still had her satellite messenger, though the display was corrupted, showing timestamps that didn't correspond to any conventional understanding of time progression. We found our way back to the base camp, or what was left of it. The tents had degraded significantly, fabric rotted and fabric torn apart as though time had accelerated in our absence. The equipment was scattered. Nothing of material value remained intact. The authorities found us 3 hours later when Stella's emergency signal finally resolved into a coherent location. We were hypothermic, disoriented, and deeply traumatized. The search and rescue team reported finding us near the Black Forest access road, approximately 2 miles from where we'd initially departed. According to every record that exists, we'd been missing for 4 days. We insisted it had been 3 days. We were taken to a hospital. No names of practitioners are required in this account, and examined by medical personnel who found us suffering from exposure and dehydration consistent with 4 days in the wilderness. Blood work suggested we'd been without consistent caloric intake for that entire duration. But we hadn't been in the wilderness. We'd been in a place that operated under different temporal rules, different environmental parameters. The aftermath was what the creatures had predicted: inconsistency, doubt, the gradual erosion of our narrative under the weight of contradictory evidence. Nathan's camera footage was analyzed by specialists. The images showed forest, showed tents, showed all of us, healthy and present, in landscapes that could have been any forest in Pennsylvania. There was no evidence of the clearing, no evidence of the archway, no evidence of anything impossible. The authorities concluded we'd become lost, panicked, and experienced mass psychological trauma that had resulted in confabulated memories. Shared delusion, they called it. Trauma-induced false narrative construction. We stopped insisting on the truth. Most of us moved away from the region, went to universities far from the mountains, built lives in places where the horizon didn't feel loaded with possibility and malevolence. We rarely spoke to each other, but we all watched for Kelly. She reappeared, as promised, exactly 4 days after we'd escaped the clearing. She was found walking along the same road where we'd been picked up, claiming no memory of how she'd gotten there. She was dehydrated and disoriented, suffering from exposure consistent with several days outdoors. Her family took her to the same hospital where we were being treated. I saw her once, briefly, in a hallway. She looked completely normal, entirely human. There was nothing about her appearance that suggested anything fundamental had changed. But when our eyes met, I felt it. The presence of something vast and attentive existing behind her gaze, the weight of an entire ecosystem operating through a single human body. She smiled. It was the same smile that the Aurora thing had offered us in that clearing. I looked away. She returned to school eventually, graduated. I found her on social media. She's in college now, studying environmental science, living in one of those college towns that has just enough edge to feel authentic. She posts pictures of hikes, of mountain vistas, of beautiful, unspoiled wilderness, and if you watch carefully, if you look at the metadata of those images, you might notice something odd. Certain photographs have timestamps that place her in multiple locations simultaneously. Certain hiking routes don't correspond to actual trails. Certain shadows in the background contain shapes that aren't quite human, or maybe that's just what exposure and trauma make you see. Maybe that's the mechanism through which the forest ensures its narrative survives, by making those of us who know the truth doubt the reliability of our own perception. I'm recording this now because I can feel something operating beneath the surface of the world, a vast, patient attention. The forest isn't limited to Pennsylvania, isn't constrained to the Appalachian ridges. It's everywhere, in every green space, in every wild place that humans think they've mapped and mastered. And it's learning. It studies us through those of us who've been transformed, the people who walked into the wild and came back wearing something else underneath their skin, the ones who know the locations of the thresholds, the boundaries where the human world and something infinitely older conduct their conversation. Ryan moved to the Pacific Northwest. He's a wildlife photographer. He spends every weekend in remote forests, documenting the places where civilization ends. He's very good at what he does. His photographs have been featured in prestigious publications. Looking at his work, you can see it. The way the shadows in his images contain intentionality. The way the wilderness in his photographs looks organized, coordinated, waiting. Stella became a geographer. She studies terrain, maps, the architectural structure of landscape. She's developed a particular interest in places where ancient human settlements disappeared without explanation, where indigenous peoples abandoned land they'd occupied for generations despite having no apparent reason. She's building a map, a comprehensive documentation of the thresholds, the places where the rules change, the boundaries between the world we think we understand and the world that's been studying us for far longer than civilization has existed. And that terrifies me more than anything I experienced in that clearing. Because I understand now, we weren't the experiment. The forest was never interested in discovering us. We were introducing it to itself, showing it how human consciousness processes fear and survival and adaptation. And now it knows. Now it's learning. The mountains are still hungry, but they're patient. They have time. And Kelly, whatever she is now, is out there, moving between the human world and whatever exists beyond the ridges, opening passages, expanding the architecture of convergence. I'm recording this for your safe consumption because someone needs to understand what's happening beneath the surface. And more importantly, I need the world to know, if you find yourself walking alone in the wild and you encounter someone who smiles like they know exactly where they belong, pay attention to their eyes. That's not human looking back. That's something that's been here far longer, wearing a shape that seems familiar. That's the forest, learning. I shouldn't be the one telling this story, but everyone else is gone, and someone needs to bear witness to what happened on that ridge in late October. My name doesn't matter anymore. What matters is that I survived, and I watched as the others didn't. What I'm about to describe will sound impossible. It will sound like the rambling of someone who's lost their grip on reality, but I've spent 3 months trying to convince myself that's what happened, and I can't. I can't because I remember too clearly. I can see their faces. I can hear the sounds they made when they realized we were no longer alone out there. This is what happened on the Appalachian Trail, when 10 of us went looking for something to believe in, and instead found something that believes in hunting us. The email had gone out 2 weeks before October, arriving in inboxes like an invitation to something sacred. Appalachian Equinox Expedition, it read, a wellness retreat for spiritual seekers, led by a man named Marcus Chen who'd built a modest following on social media. 10 strangers, 10 days, 1 mountain range, and the promise of transformation through nature, immersion, and meditation. I was 55 years old when I signed up, divorced twice, working a job I didn't care about, living in an apartment that smelled like someone else's life. When the invitation came across my screen, I felt something click into place. This was what I needed. This was the moment everything would change. John Howard, that's me, had spent the last 7 years convincing myself that contentment was impossible, and settling for numbness was the closest I'd get to peace. But that October, sitting in my living room, watching the leaves turn color through the window, I decided to try something different. Lily Ward was the first person I met when the group assembled in the parking area near Klingman's Dome. She was 56, retired from something she wouldn't fully explain, with the kind of tired eyes that suggested she'd seen too much of something she preferred not to discuss. She had white streaks through her dark hair and carried herself with the careful precision of someone who'd learned not to trust her own body. "First time?" she asked, watching me struggle with my hiking backpack. "That obvious?" I said. "You've got the look of someone hoping a mountain will fix what they broke in themselves," she said, not unkindly. "Happens to a lot of us." Christopher Torres arrived next, 37 years old, though he looked older. He had the build of someone who used to be athletic but had let it slip, muscle memory still lingering in his shoulders, but a softness around the middle that suggested the discipline had ended. He shook hands with everyone with the firm grip of a salesman, which he was, commercial real estate. He'd taken a month off for this, which he mentioned immediately, as if we should be impressed. Hannah Peterson joined us, 58, a retired librarian from Tennessee with reading glasses on a beaded chain and hands that were always moving, touching things, examining them. She pointed out plants as we gathered, offering their names and properties with the automatic ease of someone who'd done it professionally. Her daughter had gotten her into meditation, said it would help with the anxiety. Hannah wasn't convinced, but she'd come anyway. Gabriel Gray was the oldest of us at 59. He'd brought a journal and a fountain pen and spent most of the waiting time sketching the landscape in meticulous detail. His hands barely trembled as he drew. He was a retired architect, and he examined the world the way he might examine a building's blueprint, understanding it through structure and line. Zoe Ramirez was 40, beautiful in the way that made most of the men uncomfortable, because they knew they had no right to be attracted to her. She worked as a physical therapist, had no spiritual beliefs whatsoever, but had come on a dare from her brother. She treated the whole thing like a hiking trip, because that's what she thought it actually was. Anthony James was 41, the only other person besides me who'd come alone. He was a writer, or trying to be one, which meant he was mostly unemployed and living off a family inheritance he didn't like to discuss. He wanted material. He wanted a story. He was probably already writing this in his head. Natalie Watson, 39, was a nurse practitioner at a children's hospital. She had the careful kindness of someone who'd learned to maintain it while witnessing suffering. There was something fractured about her, not broken, but held together by routines and medication she didn't mention, but whose small orange bottles I glimpsed in her first aid kit. Joshua Brooks was the most cheerful of us, perhaps because he was only 30. He worked in IT, had come because his therapist recommended it, and seemed genuinely excited about the whole experience. He brought expensive gear and took photos of everything. He was the kind of person who made other people feel tired just by being around him. And then there was Leah Kelly. She was 15, and she shouldn't have been there. Her mother had been one of the scheduled participants, but Hannah Peterson mentioned that there'd been a change. The mother had some kind of emergency, and the daughter was coming instead. Marcus Chen had approved it, said the youth perspective would be valuable for the group's energy dynamic. Leah was small, pale, with dark eyes that suggested she was used to watching without being seen. She had her mother's bone structure and someone else's wariness. She carried herself like she was used to being in places she didn't want to be. Marcus Chen arrived at dusk in a truck that had definitely cost more than he probably should have spent. He was 45, South Asian, with the kind of casual confidence that came from being the person in charge. He wore expensive athleisure and had the practiced smile of someone who'd learned to make people feel seen in crowds. "Welcome," he said, addressing all of us at once. "Over the next 10 days you'll undergo a transformation, not metaphorically. The practice of intentional wilderness immersion, combined with meditation and authentic encounter, creates neurological change. Scientific change. You'll leave this mountain as different people." He talked for 20 minutes about the itinerary, the safety protocols, the meditation schedule. He didn't mention how isolated we were. He didn't mention that cell service died about 6 miles back, and his emergency satellite phone was the only reliable communication. As the sun set that first night, we set up camp in a clearing about 300 feet from the trailhead. Tents arranged in a circle, a communal fire pit in the center. The mountains around us looked ancient in the failing light, like they'd been there before we existed, and would be there long after we were gone. I remember feeling something that night, some mixture of dread and hope. I remember Leah standing alone at the edge of the clearing, looking up at the darkening sky. I remember thinking that was the last time I saw her looking like a normal person. The first 3 days passed in a rhythm of hiking, meditation, and communal meals that Marcus cooked with the efficiency of someone who'd done it for many groups before. Each day we hiked different routes, ascending higher into the ridgeline, each night returning to the base camp. The pain in my knees suggested I'd made a terrible decision. The ache in my chest suggested I was finally alive. Lily and I began walking together, falling into conversation about the kinds of things people discuss when they've decided to be honest. She told me about the man she'd been married to for 32 years, how she'd woken one morning and realized she didn't recognize him anymore. Not because he'd changed, but because she had, or hadn't. She couldn't explain it properly. "I think I came here to disappear," she said on the 3rd day, as we climbed a ridge trail in the afternoon. The leaves around us were that particular burnt orange that only Appalachia manages. "Into the mountain?" I asked. "Into becoming someone new," she said. "If I can't find myself, maybe I can become a different person, someone who doesn't remember the old one." It was the most honest thing I'd heard anyone say since coming to this place. That night, around the fire, the conversation turned to the local history. Hannah Peterson, with her librarian's knowledge, mentioned that the mountains around us held a lot of Cherokee significance. There were stories, she said. Old stories about shapeshifters, beings that could take the form of animals or people. The word she used was Skinwalker, though she noted that the term really belonged to Navajo traditions farther west. But the Cherokee had their own versions, she said, beings that walked between worlds, that could wear the shape of a man but had eyes that didn't match the face. Joshua took a picture of her while she was speaking. He photographed everything, building a documentary he never asked permission to make. No one told him to stop. Marcus seemed amused by the discussion. All cultures create myths to explain what they don't understand, he said. Fear of the unknown manifesting as monsters. Do you think that's all it is? Gabriel asked. He'd been sketching the mountains again, but he looked up from his paper. What else would it be? Marcus said. Gabriel didn't answer. He went back to drawing. I didn't notice it until the 5th day. It was subtle, the kind of thing that doesn't seem wrong until you're already looking at it. We were hiking a ridge trail, the 10 of us spread out in a loose line. When I turned to look back at where we'd come from, the path was visible behind us, steep and winding through the trees. Standing on the ridge about 200 yards back was a figure. It was human-shaped. It wore dark clothes. It wasn't moving. I stopped and waited for the others to catch up, and when I pointed it out, Zoe laughed. That's just another hiker, she said. We're not the only people on the trail. But as I watched, the figure turned sideways, and from that angle, I could see that it was impossibly thin, almost no depth to it at all. It was like looking at a cardboard cutout of a person. Hello, Anthony called out, friendly and loud. Trail buddies. The figure didn't respond. It didn't move. It just existed on that ridge, watching. Then it turned its head, not its body, just its head, and I watched it look at us. From that distance, I couldn't make out any features, but I could feel the attention, the weight of being observed. Weird person, Zoe said, and she kept walking. The figure was gone when I looked again, just vanished, like it had stepped behind a tree. No one else seemed to care. But Leah, walking near the back of our group, turned and looked at me, and there was something in her expression that suggested she'd seen it too. That night, I sat next to her while the others did their evening meditation circle. That person on the trail, I said quietly. Did you see it? She looked at me for a long moment. It wasn't a person, she said. What was it? I don't know, she said. But I know that my mom was supposed to come on this trip, and she wasn't sick. She pulled out because of dreams. She said something was hunting her. She said she'd seen it near her house 3 times. Seen what? A shape, Leah said. A man shape, standing too still, watching. On the 6th night, we hiked higher than we had before. Marcus took us to an elevation of nearly 6,000 feet, to a ridge that overlooked what he called the breath of the mountains, a valley so deep and so dark that even with our flashlights, we couldn't see the bottom. This is where the veil is thinnest, Marcus said, which I'd heard him say about the previous 5 locations. I was beginning to suspect he used the same speech at every one of his retreats, but there was something different about this place. The air felt colder than it should have been. Even though it was only early evening, the sun had sunk fast once we got this high, and the darkness that came after felt active. It felt like something gathering. We'll meditate here tonight, Marcus announced. This is the peak of your journey, your authentic encounter with the transformative power of wilderness immersion. He arranged us in a circle, 10 people and him, and he led us through a guided meditation. Close your eyes, feel your breath, release your attachments to ego, feel the presence of the mountain, feel the presence of... I opened my eyes. The other 3 people on the opposite side of the circle were looking in the same direction, up the slope. Something was moving through the trees above us. Multiple somethings, actually. Shapes that weren't quite clear enough to identify, but that moved with a wrong kind of gait, not quite quadrupedal, not quite bipedal. Something in between. Everyone keep your eyes closed, Marcus said, still in his meditation voice, but there was a new tension underneath it. No one closed their eyes. There were 6 shapes. I could count them as they moved between the trees, which meant they were large enough to obscure the space they passed through. They moved in a coordinated way, circling the ridge above us, never looking at us but never looking away either. Is this part of the experience? Hannah whispered. Don't move, Marcus said. The shapes stopped, all of them at once, like they'd been called to attention, and then one of them stepped forward, into a place where the starlight could reach it. It was almost a deer, almost a mountain lion, almost a bear. It was none of those things. It was a shape that had never been meant to be still in one form, and watching it stand there while it tried to be just one animal was like watching someone with a seizure. The form kept trying to settle into a shape, and none of the shapes fit. It had too many joints, the wrong number of eyes, a mouth that opened in a direction mouths shouldn't open. Then its head rotated toward us, a full 180-degree rotation, and I saw the face underneath the animal mask. It was human. It was the figure we'd seen on the ridge 3 days before, but now it wasn't thin. It was expansive, It was taking up too much space. It was the kind of full that happens when something tries to fill every dimension at once. And it smiled. The smile didn't happen all at once. The mouth just slowly stretched and kept stretching, and somewhere in the shape of that smile I understood that this was what it had come to do. This was why it had been watching us. This smile was the entire point. "Run," Marcus said. It was the most useful thing he'd said the entire trip. We scattered. There was no organized retreat, just 10 people who'd had the primal part of their brains activated, the part that understood that we were prey. Joshua ran past me, still holding his camera. Hannah screamed. Gabriel dropped his journal and didn't go back for it. Behind us, the shapes descended. I didn't look back. That was the saving of me. I didn't look back to see what they were or how fast they were moving or what they were going to do when they caught us. I just ran. We made it to the base camp in less than an hour, though later, looking at maps and trail times, it should have taken 3. The human mind does strange things when fear is the only thought left in it. We can run faster. We can run longer. We can run past the points where our bodies should have failed us. Marcus got us organized. We were safe in camp, he said. Tents were close together. We'd build a big fire. The creatures, and he was calling them creatures now, having abandoned any pretense that this was a meditation exercise, couldn't attack a well-lit camp. That was folklore, based on reality. Animals feared fire, but these weren't animals. We huddled in the central tent, all 10 of us, and we waited for dawn. No one slept. Leah sat between me and Lily, and I found my hand on her shoulder, because we were all grabbing onto something to keep ourselves in our bodies. Around midnight, we heard something that might have been wind, or might have been breathing. It was circling the camp, moving through the darkness, just beyond the light of our fire. We could hear it on the gravel. We could hear it in the trees. We could hear it, but we couldn't see it. "It's testing the perimeter," Gabriel said. He sounded calm. He sounded like he was analyzing a problem he'd already solved. "It's determining whether the fire is a deterrent. It's learning the camp layout." "How do you know that?" Zoe asked. "Because I'm thinking like it," Gabriel said. "That's what we have to do now. We have to think like it. Understand how it hunts. It hunts like a person," Anthony said. He was shaking. All the writer's irony had burned off him, leaving just raw fear underneath. "It hunts like someone who knows we're thinking creatures. That makes it smarter than any animal." "We need to leave," Natalie said. "In the morning, we hike out, all together, back to the parking area." "It'll be between us and the parking area," Marcus said. He was checking his satellite phone. No signal. No signal when we needed it most. "It knows that now. It knows where we came from." "Then we go the other way," Lily said. "Off trail, down the mountain." The trails are the only way that makes sense. Off trail in these mountains at night is how you break your neck, or fall into a ravine you didn't know was there until you're inside it. We argued through the night, which was just another way of saying we waited for death in shifts, some of us trying not to look out the tent walls at the darkness. Dawn came like a mercy. In the pale gray light, we could see our surroundings again. The camp looked small and vulnerable. The fire had burned down to embers, and at the edge of the clearing, standing perfectly still, was a human figure. It was wearing Christopher Torres's clothes. Christopher was still in the tent. He was alive. He was sitting next to us, but the thing wearing his appearance was standing at the edge of the camp, and it was very clearly not him. "What is that?" Hannah whispered. "It took his form," Gabriel said. "It skinned him and—" "We don't know that," Marcus said. But he was checking the tent entrance, looking at where Christopher was still sitting, still breathing, still real. "It's a trick. Some kind of psychological." "It's not a trick," the thing wearing Christopher said. Its voice was Christopher's voice, but there was something underneath it, a chorus of other tones, other voices, all trying to say the same words at the same time. When it moved like Christopher, but the movement had extra angles to it. It was using the body correctly, but also incorrectly, like someone had learned the sequence but not the meaning. "Get away from it," Zoe said, and she meant everyone else, everyone to the back of the tent. "It's not going to hurt us in the daylight," Marcus said, but he was backing away too. The thing that wore Christopher looked at us with Christopher's eyes, and in those eyes was Christopher's fear and something else, something that was looking out through him. "It takes time to wear a shape properly," the thing said. "This one is fresh, still remembering what it was like to not be this. It will settle. Eventually, it will just be Christopher Torres. No one will know the difference. It will live his life and think his thoughts and grow old and die as him, and no one will ever know what happened on that mountain. Then it turned and walked away, into the trees, and it was moving with such perfect Christopher-like naturalness that if I hadn't seen the wrong joints, the extra angles, I would have believed it was just him, going for an early morning walk. We didn't speak for a long time. "We have to leave," Natalie said finally. "Right now, everything. We just go." "It took his shape," Hannah said. "Took it completely. If it can do that with one of us." "It won't," Marcus said. "This was a warning, a psychological attack to fracture the group. We stay together, we stay focused, we signal for help." "Your satellite phone hasn't worked all night," Anthony said. "There's a ranger station 15 miles from here if we go north. We can be there by sundown." No one believed him. But we packed anyway. We took the essential supplies. We left everything that didn't fit in a backpack. And then we started walking north, away from the parking area, away from the trail we knew, into the deeper mountains. 3 days into our trek off trail, we lost Gabriel. He told us he was going to find water. He took a canteen and said he'd catch up. We didn't realize he'd gone until evening, when we were setting up a cold camp, no fire, because fire meant visibility and he was nowhere. We called for him. Zoe and Anthony covered ground in a search pattern. Nothing. No response. No body. He just vanished into a landscape that suddenly seemed infinite. Joshua wanted to wait for him. Joshua still believed that people came back. Natalie argued they should keep moving. Marcus made the decision to press on, though I watched something in him die when he did it. The last of whatever had made him seem like he was in control of this situation. 2 days later, Leah stopped walking. We'd camped near a stream that moved too fast to drink from easily, and in the morning, she wouldn't get up. "I can't," she said. "I'm sorry, I can't keep going." She was dehydrated and pale, but it wasn't physical exhaustion. There was something behind her eyes that had decided to stop fighting. "You can rest," Natalie said, kneeling beside her. "We'll stay here today." But Leah shook her head. "It's going to take someone else. It's only taken one so far, and that's not enough for it. It's going to take more, and I can't watch that happen. I can't be looking at one of you, and then the thing that's wearing you." "You're delusional," Marcus said. "From exhaustion. From stress. I'm dead," Leah said. "I just haven't stopped moving yet. And when I stop moving, it's going to be too much for me to keep being. So I'm going to sit here, and I'm going to wait, and you're going to go." Lily tried to pick her up. Leah fought back with a strength that surprised us all. We couldn't carry her. We couldn't make her move. So we left her sitting by the stream, wrapped in a blanket, with water and some of our food. None of us wanted to leave her, but none of us could make her stand up and keep walking. That was the first time I understood what it was hunting us for. It wasn't trying to kill us. It was trying to isolate us, to wear us down, to fragment our group until no one was certain who they were looking at anymore. And it was succeeding. We were 7 now. Myself, Lily, Hannah, Christopher, or the thing wearing him, Anthony, Joshua, Natalie, and Marcus. The ranger station turned out to be abandoned when we found it. 30 miles off trail in the Appalachian wilderness, we found a structure that hadn't been staffed in at least 2 decades. The roof was halfway caved in. Animals had lived in it and left. And on the wall, scratched in what might have been fingernail or might have been claw, were words. "Help, help, help, help," repeated so many times that the wall was grooved with the scratching. "Someone else," Joshua said. "Someone else made it here." We searched the structure thoroughly. No bodies, no supplies, nothing but the walls full of a single word, scratched over and over in a rhythm that suggested someone had done it for a very long time. We pushed on. 5 days after leaving Leah, Joshua was the one who stopped responding to questions correctly. He was talking about his camera, about how the light was perfect, about how everyone was going to love the documentary. We were walking through a forest so thick that noon looked like dusk, and he kept talking about image resolution and color grading, and none of it mattered anymore because Joshua wasn't in Joshua anymore. It didn't happen all at once. It was gradual. First he was just distracted, talking about things only he cared about. Then he was answering questions with sentences that didn't quite connect. Then he was smiling, a smile that was too long in the middle. And then Natalie looked at him while he was walking ahead of us, and she said, "That's not the way he walks." He'd always had a slight hitch in his gait from an old soccer injury. This thing had forgotten that detail. It was walking correctly. It was trying too hard to be a human, And that's how we knew it wasn't. When we confronted it, it didn't even pretend anymore. It just smiled that long smile and said, "I like your shapes. I like how you move inside them. I like how you don't know yet what you're going to let me have." Then it walked away, and we didn't try to stop it. That left us with 5. Me, Lily, Hannah, Anthony, and Natalie. And Marcus, who hadn't said anything in 2 days and who I was beginning to suspect wasn't entirely Marcus anymore either. There were moments when he moved too smoothly, when his reactions came a fraction of a second too late. On the 8th night after we left the base camp, Hannah was the one who understood it. We'd made a cold camp in a ravine, huddled against rocks that held the last of the day's heat. And Hannah just started laughing. A sound like breaking glass, like ice cracking under too much weight. "It's not hunting us," she said. "It's hurting us. We think we're running away, but we're just going where it wants us to go. Look at the path we've taken. Look at how we've moved." She was right. I could see it in my memory of the landscape. We'd been moving in a circle, 6 days of walking, and the mountains looked the same. We'd passed the same distinctive rock formation twice. We'd drunk from the same ravine. "It's keeping us on the mountain," Hannah said, "until we break, until enough of us have been taken that we stop being a group, until we stop believing we can escape because we know that escape was never possible. Then we stay," Lily said. "We make a stand. We choose when it ends, instead of letting it choose for us." "It will just wait," Marcus said, and when he spoke, I knew it wasn't Marcus anymore. It was still wearing his shape, but the voice underneath was the chorus of other tones. "It has nothing but time, and you have heartbeats and breaths and bleeding. It will wait for all of those things to stop. Then we'll stop them ourselves," Natalie said quietly. "There are ways, in my bag, things that can help us stop." She was talking about the medication, the pills she'd been taking since we started. There were enough, she said. If she mixed them with the water, it would be quick. It would be painless. "You're asking us to die," Anthony said. "I'm asking us to choose," Natalie said. And in that moment, in that ravine with the wrong sky above us and the thing that had been Marcus sitting at the edge of our circle wearing his stolen face, I understood what the real horror had been all along. It wasn't the shapeshifter. It was us. It was the choices we were making. It was the way we were falling apart, not because we were being hunted, but because we were discovering that we couldn't survive together anymore, that the fear was breaking us down into separate pieces, and there was no shape we could take that would fit us back together. I stood up. "I'm leaving," I said. "I'm hiking down the mountain, and I'm not stopping until I reach people and civilization and everything normal again." "It will take you," Marcus said. "When you're alone, it will wear your shape, and no one will know the difference. You'll be gone, and no one will even mourn, because you'll still be alive, still walking around, still thinking your thoughts in a body that isn't yours anymore. That's better than staying here," I said. "That's better than sitting in this ravine waiting to become nothing." Lily grabbed my hand. "Then I'm coming," she said. "I didn't leave my life to have it stolen at the end. I'll take my chances." We left them there, me, Lily, and we tried to take Anthony with us, but he refused. He said he wanted to write something down, something true, something that would explain what happened. He was still a writer. He was still convinced that meaning could be made from horror if you just shaped it the right way. We left him at the ravine with Natalie and Marcus, who wasn't Marcus. We reached the ranger station by noon the next day. We'd been walking in circles, yes, but once I stopped looking at the landscape and started just walking in one direction through it, always downhill, always in the direction the water was flowing, the mountain sorted itself out into something navigable. There was a fire lookout tower about 4 miles from the ranger station, real people inside it. A fire lookout and her partner. They had a radio. They called the county. The county sent a helicopter. That was 9 days after we'd left the base camp. The search and rescue team found the base camp empty. They found our abandoned supplies, our tents, our equipment scattered around the fire pit. They found nothing alive and nothing dead. They found Gabriel's journal about 2 miles away, wedged in a tree root. The final sketches showed something that looked less and less like anything from nature with each page. By the last drawing, it was just shapes, layers of shapes, shapes trying to be other shapes and failing. They never found the others, not their bodies, not their remains. By all official accounts, 5 people disappeared in the Appalachian Mountains, and no one has found a single trace of them. I told the authorities what happened. Lily confirmed my story. But without bodies, without evidence of a crime, without anything that could be tested and verified and made official, they had nothing to charge anyone with. I told them about the creatures. They nodded and made notes, and after several interviews, they suggested that trauma and exhaustion had created false memories, that we'd gotten lost, that the others had probably split up looking for help and become separated in the wilderness. That while it was a tragedy, it wasn't anything supernatural. Marcus Chen's family hired a lawyer. Christopher Torres sued for a settlement related to false imprisonment and psychological abuse. The case was settled out of court, which meant I couldn't talk about the terms, but everyone understood it meant money, which meant someone had decided it was better to acknowledge that something had happened and pay for it to go away than to continue insisting nothing strange had occurred. It's been 3 months now. I'm back in my apartment, back at my job, back in the life I thought I was leaving behind in those mountains. But things are different now. I see them sometimes, people who don't quite move right, who smile for a fraction of a second too long, who have that particular emptiness in their eyes that suggests the person looking out through them is not the person who was born into that body. I see people who used to be people. I see the shapes that are learning to wear us. And I understand now that the mountain wasn't trying to kill us. It was teaching us to see what was already hunting us everywhere, in every city, every town, every crowd. The things that learned our shapes and wore them until no one could tell the difference anymore. We don't talk about what happened. Lily moved away. I haven't heard from her in 6 weeks. Anthony and Natalie and Marcus never came out of those mountains. And Gabriel. Gabriel left us something in his journal. The final pages, which the authorities didn't show me until after the case was officially closed, showed something that might have been the creature. But in his final sketches, Gabriel had drawn the outline of the shape precisely, with all the correct proportions, and inside the outline, he'd written a single sentence: "It is every person who can smile and mean nothing by it." I think about that when I see the people around me in the city, when I walk past a crowd on the street and see 1,000 faces, any one of which might be a shape that learned to wear human skin and decided to stay. I think about Leah, sitting by that stream, waiting. I think about Joshua, talking about his camera while he learned to stop being Joshua. I think about the smile that was too long in the middle, and the voice that was a chorus of other tones. And I know that I survived the mountain, but I don't think I ever left it. The shape of escape was just another kind of staying. And somewhere out there, the thing that hunted us is still learning, still wearing new shapes, still smiling that smile, still patient, because it has nothing but time. And we have heartbeats and breaths and bleeding. And soon, very soon, those things will stop too. October 15th, 2023. I was 24 years old, and this marked my 6th year joining my best friend Riley on our annual trip to visit his grandparents in the remote mountains of northern Georgia. The small town of Cedar Falls wasn't much more than a collection of weathered buildings scattered along winding mountain roads, but it held a special place in both our hearts. Riley's grandfather, whom we called Pops, was a 73-year-old retired park ranger who had spent his entire life in these mountains. His stories of the wilderness, the changing seasons, and the wildlife that called these peaks home had shaped both Riley and me into the outdoor enthusiasts we'd become. The cabin sat on 12 acres of heavily forested land, surrounded by towering pines and ancient oaks that seemed to whisper secrets when the wind picked up. Every October, we'd make the 4-hour drive from Atlanta, leaving behind the chaos of city life for something more primitive, more real. This year felt different somehow, though I couldn't quite put my finger on why. Maybe it was the unseasonably warm weather, or perhaps the way the shadows seemed to stretch longer between the trees, but there was an undercurrent of unease that hadn't been there in previous years. Pops had aged noticeably since our last visit. His hands, once steady enough to thread a fishing line in complete darkness, now trembled slightly as he poured his morning coffee. But his eyes remained sharp, constantly scanning the tree line with the practiced awareness of someone who'd spent decades watching for danger in the wilderness. He'd been telling us stories all week about increased drug activity in the area, about hikers finding abandoned camps with suspicious equipment, about the kind of people who used the remote trails for purposes that had nothing to do with enjoying nature. "You boys need to be extra careful out there." He'd warned us repeatedly. "These mountains aren't as safe as they used to be. People are using the deeper trails for things that would make your skin crawl." I've reported 3 separate incidents to the sheriff's department this year alone. camps with enough chemical residue to suggest serious manufacturing operations, and the kind of people who don't take kindly to unexpected visitors. Riley and I had laughed off his concerns initially, attributing them to the paranoia that sometimes comes with age and isolation. We were young, fit, and familiar with these mountains. What could possibly go wrong during a simple night hike? But as the week progressed, I found myself paying closer attention to Pops's warnings, noticing the way he checked and rechecked the locks on the cabin doors, the way he kept his old hunting rifle closer than usual, and the way he seemed to listen for sounds that weren't quite right. The decision to go on a night hike had been mine. I'd been feeling restless, cooped up in the cabin for days of unseasonably warm weather that made daytime hiking uncomfortable. The October nights had been perfect, cool enough to be comfortable, clear enough to see the stars, and quiet enough to hear the mountains breathe. Riley had been enthusiastic about the idea, and even Pops had agreed to join us, though he'd insisted on bringing equipment that seemed excessive for a simple walk in the woods. Night hiking is different, he'd explained as he packed his old military-grade night vision binoculars. Your senses get heightened, but your visibility gets compromised. You need to be prepared for anything. He'd also insisted we carry extra flashlights, a first aid kit, and his emergency whistle, the kind that could be heard for miles in the mountain stillness. As we prepared for our hike that evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Several times throughout the day, I'd caught glimpses of movement in the tree line, just at the edge of my peripheral vision. When I'd looked directly, there was nothing there except the gentle sway of pine branches in the breeze. But the feeling persisted, a crawling sensation between my shoulder blades that made me constantly want to look over my shoulder. The sun had set completely by the time we loaded into Pop's old Ford pickup truck, its headlights cutting through the growing darkness as we made our way down the mountain road toward our chosen trail. The radio crackled with static-filled country music that seemed to fade in and out as we wound through the valleys. I sat in the passenger seat, watching the darkness press in around us, while Riley occupied the space behind me, his excitement infectious despite my growing unease. "Remember the first time we did this?" Riley asked, his voice carrying the kind of nostalgia that comes with shared memories. We were so scared of every little sound, jumping at shadows and convincing ourselves we were hearing things that weren't there. I remembered it well. We'd been 19 then, still young enough to believe that the woods held only the dangers we could see and understand. 5 years of these annual trips had taught us differently. The mountains held secrets, and some of those secrets were darker than others. Pops drove with the practiced ease of someone who knew these roads like the lines on his palm, but I noticed his knuckles were white against the steering wheel. He'd been unusually quiet during dinner, checking his watch frequently and glancing toward the windows as if expecting to see something that shouldn't be there. When I'd asked him about it, he'd simply said that the mountains had been talking differently lately, whatever that meant. The trail we'd chosen was one we'd hiked several times before, a well-maintained path that wound along a creek bed for about 2 miles before opening into a small clearing with a spectacular view of the valley below. It was popular with day hikers and photographers, but rarely used after dark. The parking area was usually empty this time of night, which made the presence of the black Chevrolet SUV all the more unsettling. "Well, that's not right," Pops muttered as our headlights illuminated the vehicle. It was an older model, maybe early 2000s, with tinted windows and enough rust and dents to suggest it had seen better days. More concerning were the 2 figures sitting inside, their faces barely visible in the darkness, but their posture suggesting they were watching us with the same intensity we were watching them. The SUV was parked directly in front of the trail entrance, positioned in a way that seemed intentional rather than coincidental. One of the men, I could see now that they were both middle-aged, both wearing dark clothing, leaned forward as our headlights swept across their windshield. For a moment, we stared at each other across the darkness, and I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "Drug dealers," Pop said matter-of-factly, putting the truck in reverse. "I've seen that vehicle before, usually around the times when the sheriff's department finds those illegal camps I told you about. We're not hiking this trail tonight." As we backed away from the parking area, I watched the SUV in the side mirror. Neither man moved, but I could feel their eyes following us as we retreated down the mountain road. The encounter had lasted less than 30 seconds, but it left me with the distinct impression that we'd narrowly avoided something unpleasant. "There's another trail about half a mile down," Pops explained as we drove away from the first location. "It's not as scenic, but it's got good elevation and decent views. More importantly, it's got multiple entry and exit points, which means we won't be trapped if someone decides to follow us. The second trail was accessed by a narrow dirt road that branched off from the main mountain highway. It was the kind of road that would be easy to miss unless you knew it was there, winding through dense forest before opening into a small clearing where hikers typically parked. Pops drove slowly, his headlights sweeping back and forth across the road surface, checking for fresh tire tracks or other signs of recent activity. "This is better," he said as we pulled into the clearing. "We can park here, about 50 feet back from the road, and start our hike from that trailhead over there." He pointed toward a barely visible break in the trees where a worn path disappeared into the darkness. But as we climbed out of the truck, I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't left our problems behind. The encounter with the SUV had left me on edge, and every shadow seemed to hold potential threats. The forest around us was too quiet, missing the usual sounds of nocturnal wildlife that should have been active this time of night. The trail was rougher than I'd expected, winding through dense underbrush that seemed to reach out and grab at our clothing as we passed. Our flashlights carved narrow tunnels of light through the darkness, creating moving shadows that played tricks on our eyes and made every step feel uncertain. Pops led the way with the confident stride of someone who'd walked these mountains for decades, while Riley and I followed close behind, our breathing already becoming labored from the steep incline. The October air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and the distant smell of wood smoke from someone's fireplace. Under normal circumstances, it would have been perfect hiking weather. But tonight, every breath felt charged with tension, every sound magnified by the darkness around us. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, unable to shake the feeling that we were being watched. "You boys are jumpy tonight," Pops observed, though his voice carried a note of understanding rather than criticism. "It's natural to be more alert when you can't see more than 10 feet in any direction. Your other senses compensate, pick up things you might miss during the day." He was right. I could hear things I'd never noticed before, the subtle creaking of tree branches, the distant sound of water moving over rocks, the soft rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush. But underneath these natural sounds, there was something else, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. We'd been hiking for about 30 minutes when we first heard the dog barking. It was a deep, aggressive sound that carried clearly through the still mountain air, coming from somewhere off to our left, maybe 300 feet away. All three of us stopped simultaneously, our flashlights instinctively sweeping in the direction of the sound. "That's not good," Pop said quietly, his hand moving to the emergency whistle hanging around his neck. "Dogs don't usually bark like that unless they're protecting something or warning someone about intruders." The barking continued, a steady, rhythmic sound that seemed to echo off the surrounding mountains. It was impossible to tell whether the dog was loose or restrained, whether it was alone or with its owner. But there was something unsettling about the persistence of it, the way it seemed to follow us as we continued down the trail. "Should we turn back?" Riley asked, voicing what we were all thinking. His usual enthusiasm had been replaced by a wariness that matched my own growing unease. "Let's give it a few more minutes," Pops decided. "If it doesn't stop, or if it gets closer, we'll head back to the truck. But right now, it sounds like it's staying in one place, which suggests it's probably tied up." We continued hiking, but the barking had changed the entire dynamic of our trip. What had started as a peaceful evening walk had become something more tense, more uncertain. I found myself listening for other sounds, human voices, the sound of approaching footsteps, anything that might suggest we weren't alone in these mountains. The trail curved sharply to the right, following the contour of the hillside, and for a moment, the barking faded to a distant echo. I allowed myself to relax slightly, thinking perhaps we'd put enough distance between ourselves and whatever was causing the disturbance. But then the sound returned, louder than before, and definitely closer. "That dog is moving," Pop said, stopping abruptly, "and it's coming this way." We stood in silence, listening to the approaching barks. They were getting closer, definitely getting closer, and now I could hear other sounds mixed in. The crash of something large moving through the underbrush, the snap of breaking branches, and underneath it all, what sounded like human voices. "We're leaving," Pops announced, his voice carrying a finality that brooked no argument. "Right now." We turned around and began retracing our steps, moving faster than we'd moved on the way up. The barking followed us, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away, but always present. It was like being hunted, tracked by something we couldn't see but could definitely hear. As we hurried back down the trail, I couldn't help but think about Pops's warnings about drug activity in the area. Were we stumbling into something we weren't supposed to see? Had our innocent night hike brought us into contact with people who had reasons to avoid being discovered? The answers to those questions would come soon enough, but not in the way any of us expected. The return journey to the truck felt endless. Every step seemed to take us farther from safety rather than closer to it, and the barking continued to follow us, sometimes echoing from one direction, sometimes from another, as if we were being surrounded. My heart hammered against my ribs as we picked our way down the rocky trail, our flashlights creating wild patterns of light and shadow that made it impossible to judge distances or identify potential threats. Pops had taken the lead, his 73-year-old body moving with surprising agility over the rough terrain. Years of hiking these mountains had left him with an instinctive understanding of how to navigate in the dark, where to place his feet to avoid loose rocks, which branches to duck under, and how to read the subtle changes in the trail surface that indicated obstacles ahead. "Almost there," he called back to us, his voice barely carrying over the sound of our labored breathing. "Another few hundred yards and we'll be back at the truck." But as we rounded the final curve in the trail, the beam of my flashlight caught something that made my blood freeze in my veins. There, parked directly behind Pop's truck, was a vehicle with its headlights on and its engine running. Even from a distance of nearly 1,000 feet, I could tell it was the same black SUV we'd encountered at the first trail. "Stop," Pops hissed, grabbing both Riley and me by the arm. "Get down and turn off your flashlights." We crouched behind a large boulder beside the trail, plunging ourselves into complete darkness. The sudden transition from light to dark left me temporarily blind, but my other senses immediately sharpened. I could hear the distant rumble of the SUV's engine, the continued barking of the dog somewhere in the forest behind us, and the rapid, shallow breathing of my companions. "How did they know we were here?" Riley whispered, his voice barely audible. "They followed us," Pops replied grimly. "Or they had someone watching the road, waiting to see where we went after we left the first trail. Either way, we're in trouble." The implications of our situation began to sink in. We were trapped on a remote mountain trail, surrounded by people who clearly didn't want us there, with no way to reach our vehicle and no cell phone coverage to call for help. The darkness that had seemed like a minor inconvenience now felt like a prison, hiding dangers we couldn't see or prepare for. "What do we do?" I asked, surprised by how calm my voice sounded despite the terror coursing through my system. "We wait," Pop said, "and we watch. Maybe they'll get bored and leave." But even as he spoke, I could tell he didn't believe it. There was something deliberate about the way they'd positioned themselves, something that suggested they were prepared to wait us out. They knew we had to come back eventually, and they were patient enough to wait for us to make the first move. Through the darkness, I could make out the faint glow of the SUV's headlights illuminating the area around our truck. The vehicle was positioned at an angle that would allow its occupants to see anyone approaching from the trail, but also provided them with a quick escape route if necessary. It was the kind of tactical positioning that suggested these weren't amateurs. Minutes passed with agonizing slowness. The barking behind us had stopped, but somehow that felt more ominous than when it had been constant. Had they called off their dog? Were they moving into position around us? Every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat. Every sound carried the possibility of discovery. Then, to my absolute horror, the SUV began to move. Instead of backing up and leaving as we'd hoped, it drove around our truck and started heading directly toward us down the trail. The headlights swept back and forth across the narrow dirt road, searching for signs of our presence. "Move," Pops commanded, his voice urgent but still controlled. Up the hill, behind that fallen log, we scrambled up the steep slope to our right, our hands and feet finding purchase on roots and rocks as we climbed. The log Pops had spotted was massive, probably an old oak that had fallen during a storm, and it provided perfect concealment from anyone on the trail below. We threw ourselves behind it just as the SUV's headlights swept across our former position. From our hiding spot, we had a clear view of the trail below. The SUV moved slowly, its windows down, and I could see the silhouettes of at least 2 people inside. They were scanning the forest methodically, their heads turning back and forth as they searched for any sign of movement. The SUV crept down the trail with predatory patience, its headlights sweeping from side to side like the eyes of some massive nocturnal predator. From our position behind the fallen log, we could see everything. The deliberate way they were searching, the way they paused at every potential hiding spot, the way they seemed to be communicating with each other through gestures and whispered words that didn't carry up to our position. My body was pressed against the rough bark of the log, every muscle tense with the effort of remaining perfectly still. A single cough, A shifted position, even the wrong kind of breathing could give us away. The October air, which had felt comfortable during our hike, now seemed to bite at my exposed skin as adrenaline made me hyper-aware of every sensation. Pops lay between Riley and me, his military training evident in the way he'd positioned himself to watch the threat below while keeping us protected. His weathered hands gripped the night vision binoculars, though he didn't dare raise them to his eyes while the SUV's headlights might catch the reflection of the lenses. Instead, he watched with the naked eye, his decades of experience in these mountains giving him an advantage over the hunters below. "They're looking for tracks," he whispered, his voice so quiet I had to strain to hear it. "See how they're stopping at every muddy spot? They're trying to figure out how far up the trail we went." The SUV paused about 50 feet below our position, and I could hear the engine idle drop as they shifted into park. Car doors opened with the distinctive creak of old hinges, and I watched in growing terror as two figures emerged from the vehicle. They were both wearing dark clothing and baseball caps, their faces hidden in shadow, but their movements spoke of people who were comfortable operating in the darkness. One of them carried a powerful flashlight, the kind used by law enforcement or military personnel, while the other held what looked like a radio or cell phone. They began walking slowly along the trail, their lights sweeping back and forth across the ground, clearly following some kind of trail sign that we'd inadvertently left behind. "Tracks," Pops mouthed silently, pointing toward the muddy section of trail where we'd walked earlier. Even from our elevated position, I could see the clear impressions our boots had left in the soft earth. The two men followed our tracks with the methodical precision of experienced trackers. They moved slowly, carefully, stopping frequently to examine the ground or confer with each other in voices too low for us to hear, but their body language was clear. They were getting closer to finding us. As they approached the spot where we'd left the trail to climb up the hillside, I felt my heart rate spike to levels that made my vision blur around the edges. The muddy area where we'd scrambled up the slope would show clear signs of disturbance, and from there, it would be a simple matter to follow our path to the fallen log. "When they find our tracks going up the hill," Pops whispered, his voice barely audible, "we move, quietly but quickly. There's another trail about 100 yards that way." He pointed deeper into the forest, away from our current position. The man with the flashlight reached the base of our hill and immediately stopped. His light swept across the disturbed earth where we'd climbed, and I could see him gesture to his companion. They'd found our escape route. "Now," Pops breathed. We began moving, staying low and trying to step only on solid ground that wouldn't show our passage. The fallen log had been our salvation, but now it was about to become our prison if we didn't move quickly enough. Behind us, I could hear the two men beginning their own climb up the hillside, their progress marked by the snap of breaking branches and the soft thud of boots on earth. The forest around us was a maze of trees, rocks, and underbrush that seemed designed to trip us up and slow our progress. Without flashlights, we were moving almost entirely by feel, our hands extended in front of us to avoid walking into trees, our feet testing each step before committing our full weight. But our pursuers had no such limitations. Their flashlights cut through the darkness like swords, and I could see the beams getting closer to our position. They were moving faster than we were, more confident in their ability to navigate the terrain, and they clearly had experience in this kind of pursuit. "The trail," Pops gasped, pointing toward a break in the trees that I couldn't see but had to trust was there. 50 more yards. Those 50 yards felt like 50 miles. Every step was a gamble, every breath a risk of discovery. The flashlight beams were getting closer, and I could hear voices now, not words, but the tone and cadence of people coordinating a search. The secondary trail Pops had mentioned was little more than a deer path, barely wide enough for single file and carpeted with fallen leaves that rustled with every step. In daylight, it would have been challenging to follow. In the darkness, with adrenaline making our movements clumsy and fear making every shadow seem like a threat, it was nearly impossible. We stumbled through the underbrush like drunken men, our hands constantly extended to feel for obstacles, our feet testing each step before committing our weight. Behind us, the pursuit continued, marked by the sweep of flashlight beams and the occasional crack of branches as our hunters made their way through the forest. "They're not giving up," Riley whispered, his voice tight with exhaustion and fear. We'd been moving for what felt like hours, though it had probably been less than 30 minutes. The physical exertion of climbing through rough terrain in complete darkness was taking its toll on all of us. Pops paused ahead of us, his hand raised in a gesture for silence. We froze, listening to the sounds of the night around us. The forest had gone quiet, Even the usual sounds of nocturnal wildlife had been stilled by the presence of too many humans moving through their territory. There, Pops pointed toward a faint glow visible through the trees. That's the main road. If we can get there, we can flag down help. But as we watched, the glow began to move. It wasn't stationary lighting from the road. It was the headlights of a vehicle, moving slowly along the mountain highway. And as it drew closer, I could see that it was searching, its headlights sweeping back and forth across the forest edge just as the SUV had done on the trail. They have more people, I realized with growing horror. They're not just following us on foot, they have someone watching the road. The implications were terrifying. We weren't dealing with opportunistic criminals who had stumbled across our presence. This was coordinated, planned, and executed with a level of organization that suggested serious criminal activity. We had walked into something much bigger and more dangerous than a simple drug operation. "How many of them are there?" Riley asked, voicing what we were all thinking. "Doesn't matter," Pops replied grimly. "We need to find another way out." But our options were rapidly disappearing. The terrain around us was becoming increasingly difficult. Steep slopes covered with loose rocks that would create noise with every step. Dense thickets that would slow our progress to a crawl, and areas of exposed rock that would leave clear tracks for our pursuers to follow. The vehicle on the road had stopped directly opposite our position, its headlights now stationary and pointed into the forest. I could see figures moving around the vehicle, and what looked like the distinctive outline of someone setting up some kind of equipment. "Night vision," Pop said, recognizing what I was seeing. "They're setting up night vision equipment to scan the forest." The technology gap between us and our pursuers was becoming apparent. We had 3 small flashlights that we couldn't use without giving away our position, while they had powerful searchlights, night vision equipment, and multiple vehicles. It was like being hunted by a military unit while armed with nothing but our wits and our knowledge of the terrain. "There's a creek about half a mile that way." Pops pointed toward what looked like impenetrable darkness. "If we can get there, we can follow it downstream. Water won't hold our tracks, and the sound of moving water will mask our movement." Half a mile had never sounded so far. The terrain between us and the creek was some of the roughest in the area. Steep slopes, thick underbrush, and multiple rocky outcroppings that would be treacherous to navigate in daylight, let alone in complete darkness while being pursued by people with superior equipment and numbers. But we had no choice. The alternative was to remain in place and hope our pursuers would give up, which seemed increasingly unlikely given the resources they were putting into finding us. Or we could try to surrender, but given what we'd stumbled into, that seemed like an option that would end badly for all of us. "Stay close," Pops instructed, "and whatever happens, don't make any noise. They're listening for us now." We began moving again, this time with even more caution than before. Every step was calculated, every breath controlled. The darkness around us was complete, forcing us to rely on senses that felt inadequate for the task at hand. Behind us, the search continued. I could hear voices calling to each other, the sound of vehicles moving along the road, and the occasional crack of someone moving through the underbrush. They were methodical, professional, and persistent, and they were getting closer. The sound of running water reached us before we could see the creek, a gentle babbling that seemed impossibly loud in the tense silence of our flight. After what felt like hours of stumbling through the darkness, the promise of the creek represented both hope and terror. Hope because it offered a way to move without leaving tracks. Terror because reaching it meant crossing exposed ground where we would be vulnerable to the night vision equipment our pursuers were using. The creek was smaller than I'd expected, perhaps 3 feet wide and maybe a foot deep, running over smooth stones that had been polished by decades of mountain runoff. Under different circumstances, it would have been a peaceful spot, the kind of place where you might stop during a day hike to rest and enjoy the sounds of nature. Tonight, it represented our only chance of escape. "Get in the water," Pops instructed, his voice barely audible over the sound of the current. "Walk in the center, try not to splash. The water will hide our scent from any dogs they might bring in." The water was shockingly cold, even through our hiking boots. October mountain water carries the bite of approaching winter, and within seconds, my feet began to go numb. But the discomfort was nothing compared to the relief of knowing we were leaving no tracks for our pursuers to follow. We moved downstream in single file, Pops leading the way with the sure-footed confidence of someone who had spent his life in these mountains. The creek bed was treacherous, loose stones that shifted underfoot, sudden drops that could send you tumbling, and overhanging branches that seemed to reach out from the darkness to grab at our clothing. "This creek connects to the main river about 2 miles downstream," Pops explained in a whisper. "There's a bridge there and a road that leads back to town. If we can make it that far, we can get help." 2 miles had never sounded so far. Every step was a battle against the current, the cold, and the darkness. My feet were completely numb now, and I could feel the beginning of hypothermia creeping into my legs. But behind us, the search continued, and the alternative to pressing on was unthinkable. As we followed the creek downstream, pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The organized nature of our pursuit, the multiple vehicles, the professional equipment, this wasn't random criminal activity. We had stumbled into something much bigger, much more dangerous. "Pops," I whispered during a brief stop to rest. "What do you think they're doing out here?" His face was grim in the faint starlight. "I think we found one of those manufacturing operations I've been reporting to the sheriff, and I think they're willing to do whatever it takes to protect it." The implications were chilling. We weren't just dealing with drug dealers or petty criminals. We were dealing with people who had invested serious resources in their operation, people who had too much to lose to let witnesses walk away. "The dog we heard earlier," Riley said suddenly. "It wasn't just barking at us, it was alerting them to our presence." That made sense. The persistent barking, the way it had seemed to follow us, the way it had stopped just before the SUV appeared. It had all been coordinated. We had walked into a trap that had been set long before we'd even decided to go hiking. "They've been watching the trails," Pops realized. "Probably for weeks or months. Anyone who gets too close to their operation becomes a target." The creek curved sharply to the left, following the natural contours of the mountain. As we rounded the bend, I could see lights in the distance. Not the searching beams of our pursuers, but the steady glow of civilization. Street lights, house lights, the blessed promise of safety and help. "The bridge," Pops pointed toward a structure barely visible in the darkness. "We're almost there." But as we approached the bridge, I could see that our ordeal wasn't over. Parked at the near end of the bridge was another vehicle, this one with its headlights off but its engine running. Someone was waiting for us. "They anticipated this," Pops said grimly. "They knew about the creek, knew where it led. They've been herding us toward this point." We were trapped again, caught between the pursuers behind us and the trap ahead. The creek that had seemed like our salvation now felt like a channel leading us directly into the hands of people who wished us harm. "What do we do now?" Riley asked, his voice carrying the exhaustion and fear we all felt. Pops was quiet for a long moment, weighing our options. Behind us, I could hear the sound of our pursuers getting closer, their search moving systematically down the mountainside toward the creek. Ahead of us, the bridge represented both escape and capture. "We have one advantage," he said finally. "They don't know exactly where we are. They're covering the most obvious exit point, but they can't watch everywhere." He pointed toward the far bank of the creek, where the terrain looked even more challenging than what we'd already crossed. "There's another trail over there, one that most people don't know about. It's steep and rough, but it leads to a different road, one they might not be watching." The decision to cross the creek and attempt the unknown trail felt like stepping off a cliff into an abyss. We were abandoning the familiar for the unknown, trading a difficult but manageable path for one that might prove impossible in our exhausted state. But as the lights of our pursuers grew closer and the trap at the bridge became more apparent, we had no choice but to take the gamble. The crossing was the most terrifying part of our entire ordeal. The creek was deeper here, reaching nearly to our knees, and the current was stronger as it approached the main river. Worse, we had to cross in the open, exposed to anyone watching from either direction. For 30 seconds, we would be completely vulnerable. "One at a time," Pops instructed. "I'll go first, then Riley, then you. If anyone gets spotted, the other two keep going no matter what." I watched Pops wade into the deeper water, his 73-year-old body moving with the careful precision of someone who knew that a single misstep could mean death. The current tugged at his legs, and I could see the effort it took for him to maintain his balance on the slippery stones of the creek bed. He made it across and immediately disappeared into the shadows of the far bank. Riley followed, younger and stronger but less experienced in reading the treacherous footing. I held my breath as he navigated the deepest part of the crossing, where the water reached nearly to his waist. Then it was my turn. The water was shockingly cold, even after the numbing effect of walking in the creek for over an hour. The current was stronger than I'd expected, and the stones beneath my feet were covered with a slippery coating that made every step uncertain. Halfway across, I felt my right foot slip on a loose rock, and for a terrifying moment, I thought I was going to fall. But I managed to regain my balance and push forward, reaching the far bank just as I heard the sound of voices from the direction we'd come. Our pursuers had reached the creek and were beginning to follow our trail downstream. "Here," Pops whispered, pointing toward what looked like a solid wall of vegetation. "The trail starts behind those bushes." What he called a trail was almost invisible, a gap between trees that might have been created by deer or other wildlife, barely wide enough for a single person. It led upward at a steep angle, disappearing into the darkness of the forest canopy. "This is going to be rough," he warned. "It's about a mile straight up, and then another mile along the ridge before it connects to the old logging road. But it's our only chance." We began climbing immediately, knowing that every second we delayed gave our pursuers more time to organize their search. The trail was everything Pops had warned, and worse. Steep enough to require the use of hands as well as feet, rocky enough to be treacherous in the dark, and overgrown enough to tear at our clothing and scratch our exposed skin. Behind us, I could hear the sound of our pursuers discovering our crossing point. Voices called out coordinates, engines revved as vehicles moved to new positions, and the systematic search began again. But this time, we had a head start and the advantage of knowing where we were going. The climb was brutal. My legs, already exhausted from hours of hiking and wading through cold water, screamed in protest with every step. My lungs burned from the effort of breathing in the thin mountain air, and my hands were torn and bleeding from grabbing at rocks and tree roots for support. But fear is a powerful motivator, and the knowledge that capture might mean death kept us moving even when our bodies wanted to stop. We climbed in silence, saving our breath for the physical effort, communicating only through gestures and the occasional whispered warning about obstacles ahead. After what felt like an eternity, the trail began to level out. We had reached the ridge, and through the trees, I could see the lights of the valley spread out below us. Somewhere down there was civilization, safety, and help. But we still had to get there. "The logging road is just ahead," Pops gasped, his voice showing the strain of the climb. "Once we reach it, it's all downhill to the main highway." The logging road was a blessed relief, wide enough for vehicles, smooth enough for relatively easy walking, and familiar enough that we could move with more confidence. We began jogging despite our exhaustion, knowing that we were racing against time and the organizational abilities of our pursuers. As we rounded a curve in the road, I saw the most beautiful sight of my life, the headlights of a sheriff's department patrol car moving slowly up the road toward us. Pops pulled out his emergency whistle and began blowing it in the pattern that indicated distress, the sound echoing off the mountains around us. The patrol car stopped, and I could see the officer inside speaking rapidly into his radio. Within minutes, the quiet mountain road was filled with the lights and sounds of law enforcement vehicles, paramedics, and search and rescue teams. "We found something," one of the deputies reported after taking our statement. "A major methamphetamine manufacturing operation about 2 miles from where you started your hike. We've arrested 6 people so far, and we found enough equipment and chemicals to supply half the state." We had stumbled into something much bigger than a simple drug operation. We had discovered a criminal enterprise that had been operating in the mountains for months, using the remote trails to transport supplies and finished products while staying hidden from law enforcement. "You boys are lucky to be alive," the sheriff told us as paramedics checked us for injuries. "These people have been responsible for at least 3 disappearances in the area over the past year, people who got too close to their operation and were never seen again." As we sat in the back of the ambulance, warming ourselves with emergency blankets and hot coffee, I couldn't help but think about how close we'd come to becoming statistics ourselves. A few wrong decisions, a little less luck, a little less knowledge of the terrain, and we would have joined the ranks of people who had ventured into the mountains and never returned. The mountains of northern Georgia are beautiful, peaceful, and full of opportunities for outdoor recreation, but they also hold secrets, and some of those secrets are darker than others. Our annual hiking trip had taught us that the wilderness can be dangerous in ways that have nothing to do with wildlife or weather, and that sometimes the greatest threat in the mountains walks on 2 legs and carries a flashlight. We never did finish that night hike, but we lived to tell the story, and sometimes that's the best ending you can hope for. The gravel crunched beneath our boots as we made our way down the winding trail toward Cabin 7. November 2019 had brought an early frost to the Adirondack Mountains, and the bare branches overhead created a skeletal canopy against the gray afternoon sky. My 18-year-old daughter Megan walked beside me, her breath forming small clouds in the crisp air as she took in her first glimpse of the remote camp that had been part of my life for over 3 decades. "It's really isolated out here, Dad," she said, adjusting her backpack straps as we navigated around a fallen branch that had partially blocked the narrow path. I nodded, remembering my own first impression of this place back in 1987 when I was just a college freshman. The camp, owned by my alma mater, consisted of 10 rustic cabins scattered throughout nearly 200 acres of pristine wilderness. Each structure was positioned strategically to provide maximum privacy, connected only by a network of hiking trails that meandered through towering pines and hardwood groves. The quarter-mile walk from the parking area felt longer than usual, weighed down as we were with supplies for our 3-day retreat. I had specifically requested Cabin 7 because it sat in what the camp staff called the glade, a small clearing surrounded by ancient hemlocks that created a natural amphitheater of sorts. A thin walking path continued past the cabin's front porch, eventually leading to the more remote cabins deeper in the woods. As we approached our destination, I felt the familiar sense of peace that always accompanied my arrival here. The cabin's rustic construction was a testament to early American craftsmanship. Massive logs hewn directly from the surrounding forest, fitted together with such precision that they had weathered decades of harsh mountain winters. The structure seemed to grow organically from the forest floor, as if it had always been part of this landscape. "Wow, it really is like stepping back in time," Megan observed, running her hand along the smooth surface of one of the porch support posts. The covered porch stretched across the entire front of the cabin, its wooden railing weathered to a silvery gray. Built into the left side of the railing was a sturdy wood rack, constructed of thick horizontal slats designed to hold split logs off the ground. I fished the old brass key from my jacket pocket and unlocked the heavy wooden door. The hinges creaked as it swung open, releasing the familiar scent of aged wood and cold ash from the massive stone fireplace that dominated the main room. The interior was spartanly furnished but comfortable. 2 well-worn leather couches arranged around the hearth, a solid oak dining table, and a galley kitchen that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1960 seconds. "No electricity?" Megan asked, noting the absence of light switches or outlets. "Propane lanterns only," I confirmed, pointing to the brass fixtures mounted on the log walls. "And no running water either. See that blue container by the sink? That's our water supply for the next 3 days." She examined the 10-gallon plastic jug positioned to the left of the simple porcelain sink, which was set into a wooden counter against the far wall. The primitive conditions were part of the camp's charm, designed to encourage disconnection from the modern world and reconnection with simpler pleasures. Behind the main room, a narrow hallway led to 2 small bedrooms, each furnished identically with twin beds positioned against opposite walls and a single window centered between them. The beds were covered with thick wool blankets that smelled faintly of cedar from the storage chests where they spent the off-season. "I call the left bed," Megan announced, dropping her duffel bag on the mattress nearest the exterior wall. "Works for me," I replied, though I couldn't shake a vague uneasiness about her choice. The window between our beds looked out into dense forest, where the last rays of afternoon sunlight were already beginning to fade between the tree trunks. We spent the next hour unloading our supplies and settling in. I showed Megan how to operate the propane lanterns and explained the quirks of the old wood-burning stove in the kitchen. By the time we had finished organizing our gear, the temperature inside the cabin had dropped noticeably, and I could see my breath when I exhaled. "Time to earn our warmth," I announced, grabbing the splitting axe from its hook beside the back door. One of the camp traditions is that every guest splits their own firewood. Good exercise and guarantees you'll appreciate the heat. Outside, a neat pile of seasoned logs waited beside the chopping block, positioned about 50 yards behind the cabin. The wood had been cut from trees that had fallen naturally in recent storms, part of the camp's sustainable forestry practices. As we worked, taking turns with the heavy axe, I found myself frequently glancing toward the tree line. The forest seemed unusually quiet for this time of day, lacking the typical sounds of small animals foraging for winter provisions. Megan proved surprisingly adept with the axe, her college softball training evident in her smooth, powerful swing. Within 30 minutes, we had accumulated enough split wood to last through the cold night ahead, plus extra for the following day. As we carried armloads of the fragrant pine and oak back to the cabin, the sun finally disappeared behind the western ridgeline, plunging the glade into premature twilight. Loading the wood onto the stone hearth inside, I built our first fire with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed this ritual countless times. The kindling caught quickly, followed by progressively larger pieces until flames danced cheerfully in the firebox. We arranged the excess wood in the rack on the porch, stacking it carefully to promote air circulation and prevent moisture buildup. By the time we had finished our preparations, full darkness had settled over the camp. The only illumination came from our fire and the soft glow of a single propane lantern I had lit above the kitchen counter. Outside, the November night pressed against the windows like a living thing, and the temperature continued its steady descent toward what the weather forecast had predicted would be a record-breaking low for this date. "I can see why you love it here," Megan said as we settled onto one of the couches I had turned to face the fireplace. "It's like the rest of the world doesn't exist." I nodded, opening the paperback novel I had brought for the trip. The isolation was indeed one of the camp's greatest attractions. No cell phone service, no internet, no distractions from the constant connectivity that defined modern life. Here, time moved at the pace of burning logs and turning pages, measured by the gradual accumulation of glowing coals rather than digital clocks. We cooked our dinner on the wood stove, a simple meal of roasted chicken and vegetables that tasted infinitely better in this setting than it would have in any restaurant. The only sounds were the crackling of burning wood and the occasional settling creaks of the old cabin adjusting to the dropping temperature. Even the wind had died away, leaving us in a bubble of perfect silence. As we cleaned up after dinner, I caught myself listening for sounds from outside, not from any sense of danger, but from long habit. In 30 years of visits to this camp, I had heard every variety of night sound these mountains could produce: the haunting calls of loons from distant lakes, the rustle of deer moving through underbrush, the sharp crack of branches breaking under the weight of snow or ice. Tonight, however, the forest remained eerily quiet, as if every living creature had decided to remain hidden. That first night, I slept better than I had in months. The combination of crisp mountain air, physical exertion from splitting wood, and the hypnotic warmth of the dying fire created perfect conditions for deep, dreamless rest. I woke naturally as pale dawn light filtered through the frost-covered windows, feeling refreshed and eager to share this special place with my daughter. The temperature inside the cabin had dropped considerably during the night. I could see my breath clearly as I quietly rebuilt the fire from the cold ashes. The ritual of coaxing flames back to life from buried embers always gave me a sense of primitive satisfaction, connecting me to generations of humans who had performed this same essential task. Megan emerged from the bedroom as the coffee began percolating on the wood stove, her hair tousled and her cheeks pink from the cold. "I can't believe how quiet it was," she said, wrapping herself in one of the wool blankets from her bed. "I usually need some kind of background noise to fall asleep, but last night was different. The silence was almost comfortable." After a hearty breakfast of scrambled eggs and bacon cooked on the old cast-iron stove, we set out to explore the broader camp property. I wanted to show Megan some of the other cabins where I had stayed over the years, each with its own character and history. The morning air was sharp and clean, scented with pine resin and the earthy smell of decomposing leaves. We hiked the main trail that connected all 10 cabins, stopping to examine the architectural details that made each structure unique. Cabin 3, where I had stayed during my honeymoon 25 years earlier, featured an elaborate stone chimney decorated with fossils found on the property. Cabin 9, perched on a small bluff overlooking a beaver pond, had been built entirely from American chestnut logs, now an impossibly rare and valuable wood. The clouds had thickened during our walk, and by the time we returned to Cabin 7 around noon, a light drizzle had begun to fall. I quickly rebuilt our fire while Megan prepared sandwiches for lunch. The cabin felt wonderfully cozy as we settled back onto the couch with our simple meal, listening to the gentle patter of raindrops on the roof. "I understand now why you've been coming here for so long," Megan said, curling up in the corner of the couch with her book. "There's something almost addictive about the simplicity. No decisions to make except when to add wood to the fire and what to read next." I smiled, remembering my own first experience of this place and how it had instantly become a refuge from the complexities of academic life. Over the decades, I had brought roommates, girlfriends, and eventually my wife to this camp. Megan was the first of my children to show interest in joining me, and I was grateful she seemed to appreciate what made this place special. We spent the afternoon reading in comfortable silence, occasionally commenting on our books or feeding another log to the fire. The rain continued steadily but gently, creating a soothing background rhythm that made the warm interior feel even more welcoming. Every so often, I would glance up from my pages to watch my daughter, noting how the firelight softened her features and gave her an almost timeless appearance. She could have been any young woman from any era, seeking solace and wisdom in the pages of a book beside a warming fire. As evening approached, the rain tapered off, leaving the forest glistening with moisture. I lit several of the wall-mounted propane lanterns, casting a warm, steady glow throughout the main room. We prepared a more elaborate dinner than the previous night. Pasta with meat sauce, garlic bread warmed on the wood stove, and a bottle of wine I had been saving for a special occasion. To new traditions, I toasted as we sat down at the oak table. To new traditions, Megan agreed, clinking her glass against mine. The meal was leisurely, and conversation flowed easily between us. We talked about her plans after college graduation, my memories of my own early career, and the changes we had both noticed in the world over the past few years. The wine and warmth of the cabin created an atmosphere of intimate honesty that rarely occurred in our normal daily interactions. As we cleaned up after dinner, I found myself feeling genuinely content. This trip was accomplishing exactly what I had hoped, providing quality time with my daughter while introducing her to a place that had shaped so many of my most treasured memories. The rain had stopped completely, and through the windows, I could see stars beginning to appear between the dispersing clouds. Perfect timing, I observed, nodding toward the clearing sky. Tomorrow should be ideal hiking weather. Megan yawned and stretched, the combination of fresh air, wine, and the hypnotic warmth of the fire making her drowsy. "I think I'm ready for bed," she announced. "That mountain air really takes it out of you." I banked the fire carefully, ensuring enough coals would survive to make morning fire starting easier, and followed her toward the bedrooms. As I prepared for sleep, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction with how the trip was progressing. Megan seemed genuinely enchanted with the camp, and we were building exactly the kind of shared experience I had hoped for. Outside, the forest had returned to its profound nighttime quiet. No wind stirred the branches, no animals called to each other across the darkness. The silence was so complete it seemed almost solid, wrapping around the cabin like a protective blanket. As I drifted toward sleep, I remember thinking that this might be one of the most peaceful places left on Earth. I was completely unprepared for what the next day would bring. The second day dawned crisp and clear, with brilliant sunshine streaming through windows still etched with delicate frost patterns. I woke feeling energized and optimistic, eager to continue showing Megan the hidden treasures of the camp property. After rebuilding the fire and starting coffee, I stepped onto the front porch to assess the weather conditions for our planned longer hike. The air was so clean and sharp it seemed to cut into my lungs with each breath. Every detail of the surrounding forest stood out with startling clarity. Individual needles on the pine boughs, the intricate patterns of bark on the oak trees, the crystalline droplets of moisture still clinging to spiderwebs stretched between branches. It was the kind of perfect autumn morning that makes you grateful to be alive and aware. Megan emerged from the cabin, carrying 2 steaming mugs of coffee, her cheeks already pink from the cold air. "It's like a postcard out here," she said, handing me one of the cups and settling onto the porch railing beside me. We spent a pleasant hour planning our day's adventure over breakfast, studying the hand-drawn trail map that had been left in the cabin by previous guests. I wanted to show her the old fire tower on the property's highest peak, a remnant from the days when forest fires posed a constant threat to these mountains. The hike would take most of the morning, but the views from the top were spectacular on a clear day like this. By mid-morning, we had packed day packs with water and snacks and set out on the trail that wound up the mountainside behind the cabin. The path was well-maintained but challenging, climbing steadily through groves of birch and maple trees that had dropped their leaves to create a thick golden carpet beneath our feet. Megan proved to be an excellent hiking companion, maintaining a steady pace while pointing out interesting rock formations and wildlife signs along the way. The fire tower, when we finally reached it after 2 hours of climbing, was even more impressive than I had remembered. Built in the 1932 by the Civilian Conservation Corps, the steel structure rose 60 feet above the tree line, offering panoramic views of the entire Adirondack region. We climbed the metal stairs to the observation platform, where a rusty logbook invited visitors to record their impressions. "This is incredible," Megan breathed, slowly turning to take in the 360-degree vista of mountains, lakes, and forest, stretching to the horizon in every direction. I had no idea the camp was situated in such spectacular country. I pointed out various landmarks visible from our elevated perch: the lake where I had learned to canoe as a college student, the ridgeline that marked the boundary of the state park, the distant peaks where serious mountaineers tested their skills against some of the Northeast's most challenging climbs. For nearly an hour, we remained on the platform, sharing stories and simply absorbing the magnificent scenery. The hike back down to Cabin 7 took less time than the ascent, but our legs were definitely feeling the effects of the morning's exertion by the time we reached the familiar clearing. The sun had climbed high enough to warm the air considerably, and we were both grateful to settle onto the front porch for a rest before preparing lunch. "I need to get that fire going again," I said, noting that the interior of the cabin felt noticeably cooler than when we had left. Should have banked it better before we headed out. Inside, I knelt before the stone hearth and began the process of coaxing flames back to life from the few remaining embers buried in the ash. The wood I had left on the hearth that morning was bone dry and caught quickly, soon producing the cheerful crackling sound that had become the soundtrack to our stay. Within minutes, warmth began radiating from the fireplace, and the cabin regained its welcoming atmosphere. Megan had taken her customary position on the couch, book in hand, when we both heard it. The sound came from directly behind us, outside the cabin but very close. It was unlike anything I had ever heard before, a rolling, rumbling noise that seemed to move from left to right across what I knew had to be the front porch. My first thought was that one of the logs from the wood rack had somehow shifted and rolled across the wooden decking, but something about the sound felt wrong. It was too deliberate, too controlled to be a simple case of gravity acting on an unstable piece of firewood. Megan and I locked eyes immediately, both of us frozen in position on the couch. "Did you hear that?" I asked, though her expression made the question unnecessary. "Yes," she whispered, "but it sounded like it came from back there." She pointed toward the rear of the cabin, which confused me because I was certain the sound had originated from the front porch area. I stood up slowly, my heart rate accelerating as I tried to process what we had just experienced. In all my years of visiting this camp, I had become familiar with every sound the forest could produce: falling branches, small animals scurrying through underbrush, the occasional larger mammal moving through the vicinity. This sound was different. It had an intentional quality that suggested intelligence behind it. "Probably just some other guests walking along the trail," I said, though even as I spoke the words, I knew they weren't true. The rolling sound hadn't been footsteps, and it had come from the porch itself, not the walking path that passed 15 feet away from the cabin's front steps. I moved to the window and peered out toward the trail, expecting to see hikers or perhaps some of the camp maintenance staff making their rounds. The forest was completely empty. No movement, no signs of human presence, no indication that anyone else was anywhere in the vicinity. Returning to where Megan sat, I could see fear beginning to creep into her expression. Her book lay forgotten in her lap, and her eyes had taken on a wide, alert quality that reminded me of how deer look when they sense a predator nearby. "I better take a look outside," I said, trying to keep my voice steady and reassuring. The last thing I wanted was for this incident to ruin what had been a perfect trip so far. I walked to the hearth and selected a piece of split wood about 3 feet long, not quite a weapon, but something solid I could swing if the situation required it. The weight of the hardwood in my hands provided a small measure of comfort as I approached the front door. "I'll be right back," I told Megan, though I noticed my voice sounded less confident than I had intended. The brass doorknob felt cold under my palm as I turned it slowly, listening for any sounds from the other side. The hinges creaked as I opened the door just wide enough to slip through, then closed it behind me with a soft click that seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness. I stood on the threshold for a moment, letting my eyes adjust to the bright sunlight after the relative dimness of the cabin interior. Every detail of the porch appeared exactly as it should. The wood rack still neatly stacked with split logs, the railing showing its normal pattern of weathered wood grain, the decking clean except for a few scattered leaves that had fallen during our morning hike. Taking 2 deliberate steps onto the porch proper, I turned first to my left, scanning the area where the trail emerged from the forest. Nothing moved among the trees, and I could see far enough along the path to confirm that no other hikers were approaching or departing. The silence was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Then I turned to the right, toward the wood rack where I believed the sound had originated. What I saw in that moment changed everything I thought I understood about the nature of reality. Hovering approximately 3 feet above the carefully stacked logs in the wood rack was something that defied every category my rational mind tried to impose upon it. At first glance, it resembled a tentacle from some massive sea creature, thick as my forearm at the base, tapering to a more slender tip, perhaps 4 feet in length overall. But this was no marine animal displaced to an Adirondack forest. The surface appeared to be a mottled light brown color marked with irregular white spots, while the underside showed a pale, almost translucent quality. Most unsettling of all, the entire form seemed to shift and shimmer as I stared at it, as if it existed only partially in the physical world I recognized. It possessed a luminous quality that reminded me of heat mirages rising from summer pavement, but far more substantial and purposeful. The moment my eyes fully focused on this impossible apparition, it reacted to my presence with startling intelligence. The appendage quickly withdrew, pulling back around the corner of the cabin with smooth, fluid motion that suggested complete awareness of being observed. There was nothing random or instinctive about its movement. This thing had been watching me just as intently as I was now watching it. What happened next taught me the true meaning of paralyzing terror. I had always been somewhat skeptical when reading accounts of people who claimed to be frozen with fear, assuming it was simply a dramatic exaggeration. Now I understood that it was a literal physiological response. Every muscle in my body locked simultaneously, as if my nervous system had simply stopped communicating with my limbs. My brain continued functioning normally, racing through possible explanations and screaming at my body to move, to investigate, to do something other than stand there like a statue. But my feet might as well have been nailed to the wooden porch decking. The split log I had brought for protection hung useless in my grip, my arm too rigid to raise it even if I had wanted to. The rational part of my mind desperately sought conventional explanations. Could it have been some kind of atmospheric phenomenon, perhaps heat distortion from the warming day creating optical illusions? Might it have been an unusually large snake, though no serpent species in this region grew to such proportions or possessed that particular coloration? Was there any possibility of an elaborate prank being perpetrated by other camp guests, though the technology required for such a hoax seemed far beyond anything readily available? None of these explanations felt adequate to what I had witnessed. The thing I had seen possessed a quality of undeniable presence, a substance that transcended any trick of light or shadow. It had moved with purpose and intelligence, responding to my appearance with what could only be described as conscious intent. Time seemed suspended as I stood there, locked in place by a primal fear that bypassed all rational thought. It might have been 30 seconds or 3 minutes. My perception had become so distorted that I lost all sense of duration. The only sounds were my own ragged breathing and the thunderous pounding of my heart, which seemed loud enough to echo off the surrounding trees. Gradually, as if emerging from some kind of hypnotic trance, I began to regain control over my body. The paralysis released slowly, starting with my fingers and working outward until I could once again move my arms and shift my weight from foot to foot. The relief of restored mobility was overwhelming, but it brought with it an even stronger urge to flee back to the safety of the cabin's interior. My first instinct was to retreat immediately, to put the solid walls of the cabin between myself and whatever I had encountered. But another part of my mind, the part trained by decades of academic inquiry to seek evidence and verify observations, insisted that I needed to investigate further. If I ran now without examining the scene, I would spend the rest of my life wondering if I had imagined the entire incident. Fighting against every survival instinct, screaming at me to escape, I forced myself to walk toward the corner of the porch where the apparition had vanished. Each step required enormous effort, as if I were moving through thick mud rather than empty air. My hands trembled as I gripped the porch railing for support, and cold sweat had begun forming on my forehead despite the warm afternoon sunshine. When I reached the corner and peered around the edge of the cabin, I found exactly what I had expected and dreaded. Nothing. No trace of the impossible thing I had witnessed. No evidence that anything unusual had occurred in this spot. The ground beneath where it had hovered showed no impressions, no disturbances in the thick layer of fallen leaves that carpeted the forest floor. I knelt down and examined the area more carefully, looking for any physical signs that might explain what I had seen. The earth beneath the wood rack was soft with recent moisture, perfect for preserving footprints or other marks. If a person had been standing here playing some kind of elaborate trick, there should have been clear evidence of their presence. Instead, I found only the natural accumulation of twigs, leaves, and forest debris that covered every square inch of the woodland floor. Standing up, I noticed something that sent another chill through my already agitated nervous system. Scattered around the base of the wood rack were numerous small branches and twigs that would have made any approach by a human being audibly obvious. Anyone walking through this area would have created a symphony of snapping and crackling sounds that I certainly would have heard from inside the cabin. Yet the rolling sound that had drawn my attention had been completely isolated, no accompanying footsteps or rustling vegetation. This observation forced me to confront an uncomfortable conclusion. Whatever I had seen could not have been produced by any conventional human presence. The physical evidence simply didn't support that explanation, leaving me to grapple with possibilities that challenged everything I thought I knew about the nature of reality. Knowing that I needed to conduct a thorough examination of the entire area before returning to face my daughter's questions, I began a systematic circuit of the cabin's perimeter. My academic training and research methodology proved useful even in this bizarre situation. I would document everything I found, or more importantly, everything I didn't find. Starting from the front porch, I moved clockwise around the structure, examining every square foot of ground for any evidence of human intrusion. The cabin sat in a roughly circular clearing about 50 yards in diameter, surrounded by dense forest that would make silent approach nearly impossible. Any person attempting to reach the building without using the established trail would have had to push through thick underbrush, inevitably leaving a trail of broken vegetation and disturbed earth. The soft soil around the cabin's foundation showed only the expected impressions. My own footprints from our wood-splitting activity the previous day, Megan's smaller tracks from when she had explored the area that morning, and the occasional paw prints of small woodland creatures going about their normal business. There were no human footprints other than our own, no trampled vegetation, no broken branches that might indicate someone had been lurking in the vicinity. As I completed my circuit and returned to the front porch, I felt a growing sense of unreality about the entire situation. The evidence clearly indicated that no other person had been near the cabin, yet I had undeniably witnessed something that appeared to possess intelligence and intent. The logical contradiction was maddening. My eyes and my scientific training were presenting me with incompatible conclusions. I climbed the steps back onto the porch and stood for a moment in the exact spot where I had first seen the apparition. In the bright afternoon sunlight, with birds beginning to resume their normal activities in the surrounding trees, the entire incident seemed almost dreamlike. Had I really seen what I thought I had seen? Could stress, altitude, or some other factor have caused a hallucination so vivid and detailed? But even as I tried to rationalize the experience, I couldn't shake the memory of how real it had appeared, how purposefully it had moved, how intelligently it had responded to my presence. Whatever I had witnessed possessed a quality of undeniable authenticity that no amount of logical analysis could dismiss. Taking a deep breath to compose myself, I opened the cabin door and stepped back inside. Megan was still sitting on the couch, but her posture had changed dramatically. Where before she had been relaxed and comfortable, now she sat rigidly upright, her book closed and forgotten beside her. Her eyes fixed on my face with an intensity that told me she was reading every detail of my expression for clues about what I had discovered. "Well?" she asked, her voice pitched higher than normal. "Did you find anything?" I closed the door behind me and leaned against it for a moment, trying to decide how much to tell her. The last thing I wanted was to frighten her unnecessarily, but I also couldn't simply pretend that nothing had happened. She had heard the same sound I had, and my extended absence had clearly given her time to work herself into a state of considerable anxiety. "I saw something," I said finally, choosing my words carefully. "Something unusual." Her eyes widened and she leaned forward on the couch. "What kind of something?" I moved to the window and looked out toward the wood rack, half expecting to see the apparition materialize again in broad daylight. The porch appeared completely normal, with afternoon sunlight casting familiar shadows through the surrounding trees. "I'm not entirely sure," I admitted, turning back to face her. It was unlike anything I've ever seen before. It appeared to be floating above the wood rack, and when it noticed me watching, it disappeared around the corner of the cabin. "Floating?" Megan's voice cracked slightly on the word. I nodded, still holding the piece of split wood I had carried outside for protection. I was unconsciously tapping it against my leg, a nervous habit that I only became aware of when I saw her eyes tracking the movement. When I went around to investigate, there was no sign of anything. No footprints, no disturbed vegetation, nothing to indicate that anyone else has been near the cabin. Megan absorbed this information in silence for several long moments. I could see her mind working, trying to process the implications of what I was telling her. Finally, she asked the question I had been dreading. "Do you think we should leave?" The question forced me to confront my own feelings about what had occurred. My first instinct was indeed to pack up immediately and retreat to the safety of civilization. Every primitive survival mechanism in my brain was screaming at me to get as far away from this place as possible. But another part of me, the rational, educated part that had spent decades teaching students to think critically about unusual phenomena, was reluctant to abandon our trip based on a single, unexplained incident. "I don't think we're in any immediate danger," I said, though I wasn't entirely convinced of this myself. Whatever I saw didn't seem aggressive or threatening. If it meant us harm, it would have had ample opportunity to act when I was standing right there. This reasoning seemed to provide some comfort to both of us, though I noticed that Megan remained tense and alert as we settled back onto the couch. I added several logs to the fire, partly for warmth, but mostly because the familiar activity helped calm my nerves. The routine task of feeding flames and arranging burning wood provided a welcome anchor to normalcy after the surreal events of the afternoon. We spent the remainder of the daylight hours in a state of heightened awareness, both of us listening carefully to every sound from outside the cabin. Every creak of settling wood, every rustle of wind through the trees, every distant bird call received our immediate attention. The peaceful sanctuary that the cabin had represented just hours earlier now felt like a vulnerable outpost, surrounded by unknown threats. As evening approached and I began lighting the propane lanterns, I found myself frequently glancing toward the windows, checking for any signs of movement in the gathering dusk. The darkness that had seemed so welcoming on our first night now felt ominous and full of unseen possibilities. As twilight settled over the forest and the interior of the cabin took on the warm, flickering glow of lantern light, I attempted to restore some sense of normalcy by preparing dinner. Cooking had always been a meditative activity for me, requiring just enough concentration to quiet an overactive mind while producing tangible, comforting results. "Why don't you keep reading while I get our meal started?" I suggested to Megan, who had been casting nervous glances toward the windows every few minutes. "I'm making that pasta dish you liked so much last time I cooked it at home." She nodded gratefully and reopened her book, though I noticed her eyes rarely remained focused on the pages for more than a few seconds before darting back to the darkening windows. The normalcy I was trying to create felt fragile and artificial, like a thin veneer covering the underlying tension that had gripped us both since the afternoon's incident. I began by clearing the dishes we had left in the drying rack beside the sink from our hasty breakfast that morning. The simple ceramic plates and cups had been provided by the camp, sturdy, utilitarian pieces that had undoubtedly served hundreds of guests over the years. As I transferred them to their proper storage locations in the cabinets above the counter, I noticed something that stopped me in my tracks. A large puddle of water had formed on the counter to the right of the sink, covering an area roughly the size of a dinner plate. The water was clear and odorless, appearing to be the same as what we had been using from our storage container, but the container itself sat on the opposite side of the sink, and I was certain the counter had been completely dry when we had left for our morning hike. I called Megan over to examine the mysterious puddle, hoping she might have some explanation for its presence. She studied the area carefully, running her finger through the water to test its properties, but appeared as puzzled as I was. "Could it have dripped from somewhere?" she asked, looking up toward the ceiling above the counter. I had already considered this possibility and grabbed a flashlight to conduct a thorough examination of the area above where the water had appeared. The log ceiling showed no signs of moisture, staining, or any other indication that water might have leaked through from outside. Moreover, the cabin's roof was steeply pitched specifically to shed precipitation quickly, making it highly unlikely that standing water could accumulate anywhere above the interior spaces. "There hasn't been any rain since early this morning," I pointed out, "and even if there had been, I don't see any way water could get through that roof." We checked the plastic water container for leaks, examining every inch of its surface and the area where it connected to the simple spigot near the sink. Everything appeared to be in perfect working order, with no signs of dripping or seepage. The mystery deepened when I realized that even if the container had been leaking, the water would have pooled directly beneath it rather than across the counter in the opposite direction. I mopped up the puddle with a kitchen towel and dismissed the incident as an unexplained oddity. Perhaps a previous guest had left wet dishes in that area, or maybe I had splashed water there myself without noticing. Though neither explanation felt entirely satisfactory, I was reluctant to assign sinister significance to every unusual occurrence. Opening the cardboard boxes of dry goods we had stored on the small table against the far wall, I reached for a package of pasta and immediately noticed that it felt wrong in my hands. Instead of the crisp, dry cardboard I expected, the box felt soft and damp, as if it had been soaked in water and was only now beginning to dry out. "Megan, come look at this," I called, holding up the soggy package. She examined the pasta box and then checked the others stored on the same table. Every single item, crackers, cereal, instant oatmeal, tea bags, showed signs of having been thoroughly saturated with water. The cardboard containers were all soft and discolored, with watermarks that indicated they had been sitting in standing liquid for some extended period. Beneath the boxes, the wooden table surface showed a large water stain that was still damp to the touch. The stain covered nearly the entire tabletop, as if someone had poured several gallons of water directly onto the surface and left it to soak into the wood. This discovery was far more disturbing than the puddle by the sink because it couldn't be explained by any conventional means. The table sat in the middle of the cabin's interior, well away from any potential source of water. There were no pipes, no fixtures, no windows directly above the area. Even if the roof had somehow leaked, which our examination had ruled out, water would have had to defy gravity to reach this location. "This doesn't make sense," Megan said, voicing what we were both thinking. "How did all this water get here?" I didn't have an answer for her. The physical evidence was undeniable. Our food supplies had been soaked while we were away from the cabin, but there was no rational explanation for how it could have happened. We checked every possible source of water in the cabin's interior, from the storage container to the primitive plumbing fixtures, but found no leaks or malfunctions that could account for the flooding. As I attempted to salvage what I could from our damaged supplies, transferring dry items to sealed containers and discarding those that had been ruined, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were dealing with something beyond normal experience. The water incidents, like the apparition I had witnessed that afternoon, seemed to violate the basic laws of physics that governed everyday reality. "Let's just focus on making dinner," I suggested, trying to maintain an atmosphere of normalcy despite my growing unease. "We can figure out the water problem later." But even as I filled a pot with water from our storage container and placed it on the wood stove to boil, I found myself anticipating the next inexplicable event. The cabin that had felt like a refuge from the complexities of modern life now seemed like a place where the fundamental rules of existence no longer applied. As we worked together to prepare our meal, carefully checking each ingredient for water damage, I caught myself frequently glancing toward the counter where I had first discovered the mysterious puddle. Part of me expected to see water materializing again from thin air, defying every rational principle I had spent my life accepting as absolute truth. Dinner proceeded quietly, both of us lost in our own thoughts as we tried to process the day's unsettling events. The pasta tasted fine, though I noticed we were both eating mechanically, without the relaxed enjoyment that had characterized our previous meals in the cabin. Every sound from outside, the settling of the building as temperatures dropped, the distant call of an owl, the whisper of wind through pine branches, drew our immediate attention. As I washed our dishes in the simple sink, using water sparingly from our container, I found myself examining every surface for new signs of mysterious moisture. The counter remained dry, the table showed no fresh water stains, and our remaining supplies appeared untouched. Whatever force had caused the earlier flooding seemed to have subsided, at least temporarily. "I think I'm ready for bed," Megan announced as I finished cleaning up. "This has been the strangest day of my life, and I'm emotionally exhausted." I understood exactly what she meant. The combination of physical exertion from our morning hike and the psychological stress of the afternoon's bizarre incidents had left us both drained. Sleep seemed like the best escape from the questions that had no satisfactory answers. As a precautionary measure, I dragged one of the metal folding chairs from the dining table and positioned it against the front door. The cabin had no locks, a deliberate choice by the camp's founders to maintain the atmosphere of trust and safety that had characterized this place for decades. But given the day's events, I felt better knowing that any attempt to open the door from outside would result in a loud crash as the chair toppled over. "Good thinking," Megan said, watching my improvised security system, "though I'm not sure what we're trying to keep out." That was precisely the problem. I had no idea what we might be dealing with, which made it impossible to take appropriate defensive measures. How do you protect yourself against something that defies rational explanation? In the bedroom, we prepared for sleep with nervous efficiency. I had positioned my sleeping bag so that my head would be near the interior wall, while Megan arranged hers with her head toward the exterior wall beneath the window. This placement had seemed perfectly natural the night before, but now I found myself wishing we had chosen different positions. If something approached the cabin from outside during the night, she would be the first to encounter it. "Try not to worry too much," I told her as I adjusted my pillow. "Whatever's happening here, it doesn't seem to be directly threatening us. We've been here 2 full days, and despite the strange incidents, neither of us has been harmed." She nodded, though I could see the tension in her shoulders as she settled into her sleeping bag. "I know you're right. It's just that everything feels so unpredictable now. I keep expecting something else to happen." I understood her anxiety completely. The sense of security that had defined this place for me over 30 years had been shattered in a single afternoon. The cabin no longer felt like a sanctuary from the outside world. Instead, it had become a stage where impossible events played out according to rules I couldn't begin to comprehend. As I lay in the darkness listening to the sounds of the forest, I found my mind racing through possible explanations for what we had experienced. Could there be some kind of geological phenomenon at work? Underground springs or gas emissions that might create unusual atmospheric effects? Might the area be subject to some form of electromagnetic disturbance that could cause hallucinations or distort perception? None of these theories felt adequate to explain the specific details of what I had witnessed. The apparition above the wood rack had possessed a quality of substantiality and purpose that transcended any environmental anomaly, and the water incidents suggested intelligence behind the phenomena, as if something was deliberately trying to demonstrate its presence through actions that would be noticed but not immediately threatening. Hours passed as I lay there, alternating between attempts to fall asleep and periods of hypervigilant listening for any unusual sounds. Megan's breathing had gradually deepened and steadied, indicating that exhaustion had finally overcome her anxiety. I envied her ability to find rest, but my own mind remained stubbornly alert, analyzing every creak and rustle from the forest around us. Sometime around 3 in the morning, I must have finally dozed off, because I was awakened by the most terrifying sound I had ever heard. It began as a faint scratching noise, so soft at first that I wasn't certain whether I was hearing it or dreaming it. But as I lay there with my eyes still closed, the sound grew steadily louder and more distinct. Something was dragging a sharp object along the exterior wall of the cabin, directly behind where Megan slept. The scratching had a deliberate, methodical quality that suggested intelligence and intent. It wasn't the random scraping of a tree branch moved by wind or the clawing of an animal seeking shelter. This was purposeful, controlled, almost ritualistic. As I listened in growing horror, the scratching sound began to move along the wall in my direction. It traveled slowly but steadily, growing louder with each passing second until it seemed to fill the entire room with its harsh, metallic resonance. The sound bypassed all rational thought and triggered every primitive fear response embedded in my nervous system. When the scratching reached the corner of the room and began moving along the wall behind my head, I felt as if the source was directly targeting me. It continued along the interior wall until it stopped at what felt like the exact midpoint of my body. There, the sound ceased abruptly, leaving a silence that was somehow more frightening than the noise itself. In that moment of absolute quiet, I began praying with an intensity I hadn't felt since childhood. "God, please don't let us be harmed," I whispered silently, repeating the plea over and over as I lay frozen beneath my covers. "Whatever this is, please protect us from it." The 30 seconds that followed the cessation of the scratching sound were the longest of my life. I lay perfectly still, every muscle tensed, waiting for something to happen. Would whatever was making the noise attempt to break through the wall? Would it circle around to try the door or windows? Was this merely a prelude to some more direct form of contact? But nothing happened. The silence stretched on, gradually being filled again with the normal sounds of the forest at night. The distant hooting of owls, the rustle of small animals foraging through fallen leaves, the gentle whisper of wind through evergreen branches. Whatever had been systematically scratching along the cabin's exterior walls had apparently departed as mysteriously as it had arrived. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 10 minutes, I finally found the courage to sit up in my sleeping bag. The movement seemed to trigger Megan's awakening, and she rolled over to face me with sleepy confusion. "Dad, what's wrong? You look terrible." I realized that despite the darkness, she could probably see the tension in my posture and the fear that I knew must be written across my features. "Did you hear anything just now? Any scratching sounds along the walls?" She shook her head, clearly puzzled by the question. "I was sleeping pretty deeply. Why? Did something happen?" Part of me was relieved that she hadn't been awakened by the terrifying sounds, but another part felt isolated by being the sole witness to this latest impossible event. How could scratching loud enough to wake me from sleep not have disturbed someone lying just a few feet away? Was I losing my grip on reality, or was there something about these phenomena that affected different people in different ways? "I heard something moving around the outside of the cabin," I said, choosing not to elaborate on the specific details. "It's probably nothing, but I want to get an early start this morning." How do you feel about packing up and heading home today instead of staying for our planned third night?" Relief flooded her expression so quickly that I realized she had been hoping for exactly this suggestion. "That sounds like a good idea," she said without hesitation. "I mean, it's been an amazing experience, but I think I've had enough wilderness adventure for one trip." We both understood that her diplomatic phrasing concealed a desperate desire to escape from whatever was happening at this place. The cabin that had promised peaceful retreat from civilization had become a source of inexplicable terrors that challenged our basic understanding of reality. I rebuilt the fire one last time, partly to provide warmth for our morning preparations, but mostly because the familiar task helped calm my shattered nerves. As coffee percolated on the wood stove, we efficiently packed our gear with the focused urgency of people fleeing a disaster zone. Every item was checked, rechecked, and secured for travel as if our lives depended on leaving nothing behind. Breakfast was a hurried affair of instant oatmeal and coffee consumed while standing rather than sitting. Both of us seemed reluctant to settle into any routine that might delay our departure. I found myself frequently checking my watch, calculating how long it would take to complete our packing and make the quarter-mile walk back to the parking area. As I was loading our supplies into backpacks, I noticed that Megan kept glancing nervously toward the windows, as if expecting to see something looking back at her from the forest. Her anxiety was contagious, and I found myself doing the same thing, scanning the tree line for any signs of movement or unnatural presence. "Let me ask you something," I said as we made final preparations to leave. "Before we go, I want to check with the camp manager about whether other guests have reported unusual experiences in this cabin. Would you rather wait in the car while I do that, or come with me to the office?" "I'll come with you," she said immediately. "I don't want to be alone anywhere on this property right now." I understood her feelings completely. The sense of safety that should have characterized this remote wilderness retreat had been completely shattered by events that defied rational explanation. Neither of us wanted to spend another moment here alone. We conducted a final inspection of the cabin's interior, ensuring that we had left everything clean and properly arranged for the next guests. The primitive accommodations that had seemed charming and romantic just 3 days earlier now felt ominous and forbidding. I was grateful to step outside and close the door for what I suspected would be the last time. The walk back to the parking area passed in tense silence, both of us alert for any unusual sounds or movements from the surrounding forest. Every snapping twig or rustling branch caused us to freeze momentarily, listening carefully before continuing our retreat. The familiar trail that had seemed like a pleasant woodland stroll when we arrived now felt like a gauntlet to be endured rather than enjoyed. When we finally reached my car and loaded our gear into the trunk, I felt a profound sense of relief that surprised me with its intensity. The simple act of sitting in the driver's seat and turning the key in the ignition represented a return to a world governed by predictable physical laws and rational cause and effect relationships. Before leaving the camp property entirely, I drove to the small administrative building where the camp manager maintained his office. Mr. Andrews had been overseeing this facility for nearly 15 years, and I hoped he might be able to provide some context for what we had experienced. "Any problems with Cabin 7? He asked as I signed out and returned the key. "Actually, yes," I said, deciding to be direct about our experiences. "We had some unusual incidents that I wanted to ask you about. Have other guests reported anything strange happening in that particular cabin?" His expression immediately became more serious, and I noticed him glance quickly toward where Megan was waiting in the car. "What kind of unusual incidents?" I gave him a brief summary of the major events. The apparition above the wood rack, the mysterious water incidents, and the scratching sounds during the night. I watched his face carefully as I spoke, looking for any sign of recognition or understanding. When I finished, he was quiet for several long moments, clearly weighing his response carefully. Finally, he said, "This is the third report of unusual activity in Cabin 7 this season. I've been documenting these incidents and trying to decide whether we should take the cabin out of service temporarily." This revelation was both validating and deeply unsettling. On one hand, it confirmed that we hadn't imagined or exaggerated what had happened to us. Other people had experienced similar phenomena in the same location, suggesting that something genuinely anomalous was occurring there. On the other hand, the fact that the camp management was aware of ongoing problems but had continued renting the cabin raised serious questions about their responsibility to guest safety. "What exactly have other people reported?" I asked. "Similar things to what you've described," he said reluctantly. "Unexplained sounds, objects moving on their own, the appearance of water where none should be present. One family left in the middle of their first night, and a couple from Boston requested a different cabin after experiencing what they called impossible events. As we drove away from the camp that morning, I found myself looking back repeatedly in the rearview mirror, as if expecting to see something following us down the winding mountain road. It wasn't until we reached the main highway and began our journey back to civilization that I finally began to relax. The 3-hour drive home passed mostly in contemplative silence, both of us processing what we had experienced and trying to integrate it into our understanding of the world. By the time we reached familiar suburban streets, the events at the cabin had begun to take on an almost dreamlike quality, as if they had happened to someone else or in some alternate reality. But I knew I would never forget what I had seen above that wood rack, or the sound of purposeful scratching moving along the cabin's walls in the darkness. Something had shared that forest clearing with us, something that challenged every assumption I had ever made about the nature of reality. To this day, I have never returned to that camp, though I continue to receive their annual newsletters and promotional materials. The part of me that spent 30 years finding peace and renewal in that wilderness setting has been permanently altered by 3 days of impossible events that I cannot explain but can never deny. Sometimes, late at night when sleep proves elusive, I find myself wondering what would have happened if we had stayed for that third night as originally planned. Would the phenomena have escalated? Would we have gained some deeper understanding of what was sharing that space with us? Or would we have found ourselves confronting something far more directly threatening than mysterious scratches and unexplained water? I suppose I will never know the answers to those questions, but I am certain of one thing. There are aspects of our world that extend far beyond the boundaries of conventional scientific understanding, and sometimes, in remote places where civilization has barely left its mark, those hidden dimensions of reality become briefly visible to ordinary people going about their ordinary lives. The Adirondack Mountains continue to draw thousands of visitors each year, most of whom return home with nothing more unusual to report than spectacular sunsets and restorative solitude. But for my daughter and me, that particular corner of the wilderness will forever remain a place where the impossible briefly became real, leaving us with memories that no rational explanation can dismiss or diminish. It was the middle of winter, early January 2023. The holiday decorations had barely been packed away when my cousins suggested we take advantage of the long weekend. I was 28 then, desperately needing an escape from my mind-numbing office job. This time of year, right after Christmas, our region typically receives substantial snowfall, perfect for a secluded getaway. Elliot called me on a Tuesday evening. "Hey, I've been talking with Grant. Uncle Philip said we could use his cabin for the weekend. What do you think?" Thursday to Saturday, just the three of us. The proposition was tempting. 3 days away from deadlines and fluorescent lighting sounded like paradise. Uncle Philip's cabin was nestled in the Sawyer Mountains, about 3 hours from town. Remote enough to feel disconnected, but not so isolated that we'd be completely cut off from civilization. "Did Uncle Philip mention anything else about the cabin?" I asked, remembering vague stories from family gatherings. Elliot hesitated. "Well, he did say something about his kids seeing things. Apparently their 6-year-old was standing at the kitchen window last summer and started pointing outside. When Aunt Donna asked what he was looking at, the boy said there was a woman standing in the yard. Aunt Donna checked, but nobody was there." "That's it? A kid with an imaginary friend?" I laughed, relieved it wasn't something more unsettling. "Pretty much. Oh, and there's a winter storm coming, but nothing serious. We all have 4-wheel drives, and we know how to handle snow. Worst case, we get stuck with extra hot chocolate and board games." I agreed without much hesitation. The three of us had been close since childhood, Elliot with his perpetual optimism, Grant with his practical sensibility, and me somewhere in between. If anyone could make a weekend in a potentially haunted cabin enjoyable, it was us. We spent the next day gathering supplies, food to last 3 days, sleeping bags in case the heating was unreliable, firewood, portable chargers, and a medical kit Grant's insistence. The meteorologist on the evening news mentioned potential heavy snowfall in the mountains, but nothing that concerned us. We'd driven through worse conditions before. What I didn't realize then was how thoroughly we'd underestimated both the weather and the cabin itself. Had I known what waited for us in those mountains, I would have fabricated any excuse to stay home. But ignorance propelled us forward, 3 cousins seeking relaxation, unaware that we were driving straight into a nightmare that would forever change us. Thursday afternoon arrived with overcast skies and a steady drop in temperature. We loaded our respective trucks, mine a weathered Ford, Elliot's a relatively new Chevy, and Grant's rugged Dodge, and began our journey at precisely 2:15 p.m. The plan was to reach the cabin before dark, get settled, and enjoy a warm dinner by the fireplace. The first 2 hours of driving were uneventful. We traveled in a convoy, maintaining visual contact through our rearview mirrors. The radio forecasted increasing snowfall for the mountains, but nothing that set off alarm bells. As we turned onto the unmarked gravel road leading to the property, light flurries began dusting our windshields. "This is nothing," I reassured myself, watching the wipers clear thin layers of white powder, just enough to make it feel like a proper winter retreat. The cabin appeared gradually through the trees, a large 2-story structure built primarily of dark timber and stone. It was considerably more imposing than I'd imagined from Uncle Philip's descriptions. The roof sloped steeply to prevent snow accumulation, and the windows were smaller than modern designs, giving it an older, more ominous appearance than I'd expected. We parked in a semicircle facing the cabin's entrance, the snow now falling steadily around us. The temperature display on my dashboard read 28 degrees Fahrenheit. "Home sweet home for the next couple days," Elliot called out as we grabbed our bags. His breath formed dense clouds in the frigid air. The cabin key was hidden under a hollow rock by the front steps, exactly where Uncle Philip said it would be. The door opened with a protesting creak, revealing a surprisingly spacious interior. The main floor consisted of an open living area with a stone fireplace, a kitchen with dated appliances, and a dining space with a heavy wooden table. A staircase led to the second floor, where I presumed the bedrooms were located. "It's cold as hell in here," Grant muttered, dropping his bags near the entrance. "Let's get a fire going before we unload everything else." The fireplace was substantial, clearly the main source of heat for the cabin. While Grant inspected it, Elliot and I explored the rest of the space. The kitchen cabinets contained basic cooking utensils, mismatched plates, and a few pantry staples. A landline telephone sat on a small table in the corner, our only communication with the outside world, as cell service was non-existent this far into the mountains. Upstairs, we found 3 bedrooms, 2 with queen beds and 1 with twin beds, plus a bathroom with a clawfoot tub and no shower. The walls were decorated with faded photographs of landscapes and ancient hunting trophies that stared down with glass eyes that seemed to follow our movements. "I call the room that doesn't have dead animals watching me sleep," I announced, claiming the smallest bedroom with the twins. By the time we finished unpacking, Grant had a robust fire crackling in the fireplace. Outside, the snow was falling more heavily, accumulating on the ground at a concerning rate. The wind had picked up as well, whistling through tiny gaps in the cabin's structure. "I think we beat the storm by just a couple hours," Grant said, looking out the window. "Another hour on the road and we might have had trouble getting here." We settled in for the evening, preparing a simple dinner of pasta and canned sauce. The cabin grew warmer, more inviting. As night fell completely, we sat around the fire with beers in hand, exchanging stories and laughing, 3 cousins enjoying the isolation and each other's company. None of us mentioned the child's story about the woman outside the window. None of us wanted to invite that thought into our consciousness as darkness enveloped the cabin and the sounds of the forest became increasingly audible through the howling wind. It was nearly midnight when we decided to turn in. The storm outside had intensified, battering the windows with snow and creating drifts against the cabin walls. The wind produced strange sounds, moans and whispers that I attributed to air passing through the trees and the cabin's old timber frame. As I climbed into bed, pulling the heavy quilt up to my chin, I noticed how the moonlight filtered through the snow-crusted window created unusual patterns on the wall, shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. I closed my eyes tight, forcing myself to attribute it to fatigue and the effects of the beer. I fell asleep listening to the storm's fury, unaware that it was the last peaceful night's sleep I would have for a very long time. I awoke to the unmistakable aroma of breakfast cooking bacon, sizzling, eggs frying, the rich scent of freshly brewed coffee. The smell was so vivid, so enticing, that it pulled me from the depths of sleep instantly. Sunlight streamed through the window. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind a pristine white landscape. The bedside clock read 7:23 a.m., unusual for either Elliot or Grant to be awake this early on vacation, but the smell suggested someone was preparing a feast. My stomach growled in anticipation as I pulled on a sweater and shuffled toward the kitchen. In the hallway, I encountered Elliot, his hair disheveled from sleep, eyes half-lidded. Man, whoever's cooking deserves a medal, he yawned, rubbing his eyes. I'm absolutely starving. Together, we descended the stairs, following the mouth-watering aroma that grew stronger with each step. The kitchen doorway framed a scene bathed in morning light, countertops gleaming, the old stove standing sentinel against the wall, a kettle on the countertop. But no food, no pans on the stove, no plates set out, and no Grant. What the hell? Elliot muttered, looking around in confusion. You smell that, right? I'm not hallucinating? I nodded slowly, approaching the stove and placing my hand near the surface. Cold, completely cold, as though it hadn't been used in days. The coffee maker sat unplugged in the corner, the kettle empty and cool to the touch. Yet the smell persisted. Bacon, eggs, sausage, coffee so real I could almost taste it. Morning. Grant's voice startled us both. He stood in the doorway, fully dressed. You guys smell it too, huh? We nodded in unison. Been like this since I woke up 20 minutes ago, Grant continued, moving to examine the stove himself. At first I thought one of you was cooking, but nobody's cooking anything, I finished, feeling a distinct uneasiness settle in my stomach. So where's the smell coming from? We searched the kitchen thoroughly, checking cabinets, looking behind appliances, even inspecting the ventilation, finding nothing that could explain the phantom breakfast scents that still hung heavily in the air. Uncle Philip didn't mention anything about ghost cooking, did he? Elliot attempted to joke, but his voice lacked conviction. Let's just make some actual breakfast, Grant suggested pragmatically. Maybe we're all just hungry and imagining things. But as I gathered eggs and bacon from our cooler, I couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that we weren't alone in the cabin. The aroma had begun to fade, but occasionally intensified without warning, as though someone invisible was moving pans around a hot stove right beside us. We ate in relative silence, occasionally glancing toward the empty stove that still seemed to be the source of phantom cooking smells. Outside, the snow glistened under a clear sky, at least 8 inches deep based on the drift against the porch railing. We should check on the trucks, Grant said finally, breaking the uncomfortable silence. Make sure they're good to go in case this weather turns again. Forecast said there might be another system moving in tomorrow. The suggestion seemed reasonable, practical even, but as we bundled up to step outside, I couldn't help feeling we were all looking for an excuse to leave the kitchen and its inexplicable sensory anomaly behind. None of us mentioned that the cabin's young visitor had only reported seeing a woman outside, not experiencing phantom smells. None of us wanted to consider what that might mean, that perhaps the cabin had more than one story to tell. The day had transformed into a postcard-perfect winter scene. Sunlight reflected brilliantly off the snow, and the trees stood heavily laden with white. Under different circumstances, I might have found it beautiful. Instead, every shadow among the trees seemed to harbor watchful eyes, and the pristine stillness felt artificial, too perfect, too quiet. We trudged through knee-deep snow to our vehicles, our boots leaving deep impressions in the untouched white surface. The temperature had risen slightly, but remained well below freezing. Let's start them up and let them run for a bit, Grant suggested, pulling keys from his pocket. Battery drain happens fast in this cold. I nodded in agreement, reaching my truck first. The door opened with resistance, snow falling from the frame as I climbed inside. The interior was freezing, the leather seat stiff beneath me. I inserted the key into the ignition and turned it confidently. The engine made a weak rattling sound, then nothing, just a hollow click. Come on, I muttered, trying again. Same result, a pathetic attempt to turn over, then silence. Through my frosted window, I could see Elliot and Grant experiencing similar issues. Elliot stood beside his open driver's door, repeatedly turning his key while Grant had his hood up, staring at his engine with visible frustration. I exited my truck and approached them. Battery issues? It's not the battery, Grant said firmly, wiping his hands on his jeans. At least not in mine. Everything's connected properly, and these are all relatively new vehicles. All three wouldn't have battery failure simultaneously. Could it be the cold? Elliot suggested. Grant shook his head. We've driven in colder conditions. Something's not right. We spent the next hour checking engines, connections, and fluids. All three trucks appeared to be in perfect working order, yet none would start. It made no mechanical sense. Let's call for help, I suggested.